Audio check. Okay, good morning, everyone. It's 9:30 and we shall reconvene. Just a procedural point this morning. Ms Vincent has started to look at the programming and timetabling for the sessions, the 3 weeks after the break. Based on the time estimates, Climate Change Week, we're running to 6 full days. And obviously we've got 4 full days. Some of the examination in chief and cross-examination is very lengthy. No particular names or blame or anything like that, but if you could all have a look at that, please, because it's quite a tight week. We'll come back to it, but if you can advise if there is any room for manoeuvre, that would be we would be very grateful. Okay. Before we kick off with Dr. Broomfield's examination in chief, is there anything else I need to raise this morning? Any procedural bits? No. Okay. No. Okay. Great. Right. Well, over to you then, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Madam. I'm going to take Dr. Broomfield through his evidence in the usual way. You're going to need to have to hand his proof and appendices and his summary and rebuttal. You will also, I think, need Mr. Pearce's proof and rebuttal. There are a number of other documents we'll refer to along the way, but I'm afraid I haven't produced a list, so again, it's back risk for me. But hopefully it won't delay us unnecessarily. Right, so I'm going to start with the introduction for Dr. Broomfield. You are Dr. David Mark Broomfield, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you're employed as an Associate Director with Ricardo Energy and Environment. And that consultancy is the largest specialist air quality consultancy in the UK, is that right?
I believe so, yes.
You explained that your consultancy provides services on air quality, on wider energy and environmental issues to a wide range of national and local government, commercial, international and other clients.
That's correct.
And you've held your position for 11 years, since April 2010. Is that correct?
Correct.
Prior to joining Ricardo and its predecessor, AEA Technology, you had 18 years' experience as an air quality and odour specialist in the environmental consultancy sector and in industry, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. You explained that you have a BA in natural sciences with a chemistry first class from the University of Cambridge, and a PhD in atmospheric chemistry from the University of York, is that right?
That's correct.
You've acted as an expert witness at public inquiries, court hearings and other formal and informal proceedings on 40 previous occasions, providing written and verbal evidence on issues including air quality impact assessment, road traffic emissions, the effect of emissions to air on natural ecosystems, odours, environmental and health effects of waste management, and perception of risks to health. And you explained that you're a member of the Institute of Air Quality Management, is that correct?
That's all correct.
Thank you. You also explain in your proof that you've carried out numerous projects in relation to the assessment of air quality impacts associated with transportation, residential, industrial and other commercial, industrial and infrastructure developments. And in relation to air quality impacts of airport operations and development, you carried out projects in relation to Heathrow, where you supported the local authorities at the Terminal 5 planning inquiry.
Indeed.
On the opposite side to Mr. Humphreys and myself.
Yes, a long time ago though, yes.
It was a very long time ago. I was a lot thinner in those days. You also explained that you've carried out projects in relation to Gatwick Airport as well.
Yes.
And more recently, you were the air quality expert witness on behalf of Uttlesford District Council at the planning inquiry following refusal of permission for a proposed increase of capacity at Stansted Airport. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. you set out in your proof your expertise in relation to these proceedings, and you confirm that the evidence that you prepared and provided in your proof of evidence is true, and you confirm that the opinions expressed are your true and professional opinions. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. Fine. You've also set out your code of the code of professional conduct, which binds you, and you confirm that you've complied with that professional obligation in preparing your evidence.
I have, yes.
Thank you. Now, if we, with that short introduction, we're going to take your evidence as read, as we've done with all the other witnesses, and we'll just focus on what we believe to be the key points of difference. But we're going to start, please, with changes in circumstances since the officers reported to committee in March of last year. Now, can you just explain what circumstances you believe have changed?
Yes, so there's been a number of changes and developments since the planning committee meetings that were held early in 2020. So these include changes in forecast passenger numbers, change to the assessment year, updated information on air quality standards and policy, and the publication of the Clean Air Strategy. There were updated aircraft schedules, so the one-day schedule for 10 and 12 MPPA, and updated information on the total movements per year by aircraft type. Then there were updated road traffic forecasts, and this information was in the environmental statement addendum, updated engine emissions data, updated modelling using ADMS roads, and an updated emissions calculations using the latest version of the emission factor toolkit, and no longer using the database referred to as the CURED, C-U-R-E-D database. There were updated background air quality maps and updated information on background deposition rates and critical loads for assessing impacts on habitat sites. So the net result of this was to result in lower levels of forecast air pollution, and as a result there was an improved position, and a comparison was introduced with the World Health Organization guidelines, which hadn't previously been provided. And finally, in the environmental statement addendum, there was a reference to ultrafine particulate matter, which hadn't been before the committee. So I believe those are the main points of update.
Okay, thank you. Now, you refer to the policy context for consideration of the air quality issues, in this case in your proof, and you summarise those in your summary on the third page. Can you just take us to paragraph 6 of your summary and just outline the position from paragraph 6 to 11, please?
Yes, so paragraph 6 to 11 cover the policy context. International environmental policy is based on the principle that emissions of air pollutants should be avoided where possible, prevented if they cannot be avoided, and where they cannot be prevented, for controls to be imposed to reduce emissions so far as possible. This is particularly important for PM 2.5. National air quality policy sets standards for air quality and includes a commitment to significantly tighten the current air quality objective for PM 2.5. It is important that a large-scale and long-term project should take the commitment to a tightening of air quality policy at a national level into account. Compliance with these standards is an important factor to be taken into account in assessing the air quality impacts of a development, but does not provide a complete assessment of the potential impacts of the proposed development because of the effects on health which occur even when levels of airborne pollutants comply with the current national air quality standards. National aviation policy requires airports to deliver improvements in air quality where possible. It is not enough simply to avoid exceeding air quality standards. Airports should be seeking to demonstrate ongoing improvements in air quality by providing innovative solutions and incentives against ambitious targets. National planning policy is that development should, wherever possible, help to improve local environmental air quality conditions. Opportunities to improve air quality or mitigate impact should be identified. The test for whether a development can be viewed as delivering improvements in air quality is to compare the future situation if the proposed development goes ahead with the future situation if it does not go ahead. The North Somerset vision includes a shared priority of improving health and well-being on page 2 of that document and emphasises the importance of reducing traffic pollution. North Somerset Core Strategy CS26 requires a health impact assessment to be carried out. This should identify the potential health gains that could result from new development and ensure that it delivers improved health and well-being consistent with national aviation and planning policy. Policies CS3 and CS23 require environmental issues to be resolved to an acceptable and satisfactory level.
Thank you. Now, just some supplementary questions from me in relation to the policy context, if I may. If we look at your main proof of evidence, paragraph 33, you provide the inquiry with page 30, it's on page 13 of the proof. I'm trying to take you to page 12, paragraph 29. You refer to the EU treaty, which explains that action by the community relating to the environment shall have the following objectives: to preserve, protect and improve the quality of the environment, to contribute towards protecting human health, to ensure a prudent and rational utilisation of natural resources. And it says, action by the community relating to the environment should be based on the principles that preventative action should be taken, that environmental damage should as a priority be rectified at source, and that the polluter should pay. And you explain and go on to refer to the air quality directives that were then produced, and the second recital of the 2008 Air Quality Directive, which refers to the particular importance to combat emissions of pollutants at source, and it says that emissions of harmful air pollutants should be avoided, prevented or reduced, and appropriate objectives set for ambient air quality taking into account relevant WHO standards, guidelines and programmes. You also refer to the 11th recital, which specifically relates to PM 2.5. There is as yet no identifiable threshold below which PM 2.5 would not pose a risk, it says, and it says that the approach should aim at a general reduction of concentrations in the urban background. You also refer in this section of your evidence to, in footnote 2, to the case of Rockware Glass and Quinn Glass, where the Court of Appeal said, to put it bluntly, those who for their commercial purposes introduce potentially polluting operations have to be closely controlled and cannot freeload on non-polluting local citizens by simply claiming that the air quality standards to which we all contribute has not yet been damaged. Now, taking all of that in the round, at a high level, what is the basic approach that we're seeing dripping down through European approach to air quality and the management of emissions?
So I think we see a hierarchy of approach, that pollution should be avoided, prevented and reduced in that order. I think we see an acknowledgement that air pollution can have effects at levels below the currently applicable air quality standards, and that provides further impetus to deliver improvements in air quality. So I see a clear direction that air quality should improve, and I think that's written into the documents you've referred to. And finally, there's a principle that those who are causing pollution should bear the costs of that pollution.
Thank you. And to what extent does that approach apply even where air quality standards are being met? Yes, so the documents that are listed there in my evidence confirm that, that those requirements to improve air quality apply even when air quality standards are met. And the main reason for that is because air pollutants have effects, continue to have effects even at levels below those air quality standards. Thank you. Now, you also refer in your proof of evidence to national aviation policy. And if we turn on in your proof to page 15, at paragraph 41, you provide a quotation from the Aviation Policy Framework from 2013, which we know as CD 6.1. And there we see a reference to studies showing that nitrogen oxide emissions from aviation-related operations reduce rapidly beyond the immediate area around the runway. Road traffic remains the main problem with regard to NOx in the UK. Airports are large generators of surface transport journeys and as such share a responsibility to minimise the air quality impact of these operations. The government expects them to take this responsibility seriously and to work with the government, its agencies and local authorities to improve air quality. Now, how do you interpret that?
Yes, so as I set out in my proof of evidence in the following paragraph, airports should not just avoid significant impacts in relation to air quality standards, but should actively be seeking to improve air quality.
Okay. And at paragraph 43, you refer to the focus of the APF being on NOx, and you also refer to its approach to particulate matter, where it says PM limits are largely met. Now, you've also referred in your evidence to the clean air strategy and the approach in that. To what extent is the approach to particulate matter in the APF reflective of the later clean air strategy approach from 2019?
Yes, I think in this regard, the aviation policy framework is out of date, and that the science and understanding and policy relating to PM 2.5 has moved on since it was published in 2013. So although those, the particulate matter limits that it refers to are largely met in much of the UK and in the vicinity of Bristol Airport, we now understand that those limits are not fully protective of health, and indeed the clean air strategy sets out a clear intention and direction to tightening those air quality standards. So it's no longer, I think, sufficient to say that the particulate matter limits are largely met. Airports need to continue to focus on both NOx and particulate matter in relation to air quality.
Thank you. And just so that we can tie the two things together, if we turn in your evidence to where you address the clean air strategy, just trying to find the reference now, I've lost it. I think it's page 13 of your evidence. Yes.
Sorry, which page?
Page 13, paragraph
13.
34 and following, madam. Sorry. We can see in that section you address the Clean Air Strategy from 2019, and on paragraph 36 you set out a passage relating to the PM 2.5 that you were just discussing, and we can see in the extracts you've produced in the first paragraph the government says all our ambitions to reduce average population exposure will deliver positive health benefits. That's why we've already signed up to meet ambitious emissions ceilings by 2020 and 2030, and why we now want to go further by setting a new world-leading goal to reduce human exposure to PM 2.5, and it explains how it sets its goals. It refers to the WHO guidelines recommending an ultimate goal for concentrations of PM 2.5 of 10 micrograms per metre cubed. It explains that's less than the EU limit, and it's a significant challenge. And then at the end of that second paragraph, it says this: reflecting this, we will set a bold new goal to aggressively cut public exposure to particulate matter pollution as suggested by the WHO. It refers to publishing evidence and to use the action that they identify to set a new ambitious long-term target to reduce people's exposure to PM 2.5 even further. And then it goes over the page to say this will set a clear national ambition to drive down human exposure to PM 2.5 as rapidly as is feasible. Yeah. So if we put that in the context of what you were just saying about the APF, how does that support the view that the APF is out of date?
Yes, so the Clean Air Strategy is clearly flagging an intention to tighten the air quality standard for PM 2.5 towards and quite possibly up to the World Health Organization guideline, which is substantially tighter than the current standards. So where then the National Aviation Policy Framework says that the air quality standard for PM 2.5 is achieved, the new standard is unlikely to be achieved, and the evidence in front of this inquiry indicates that it isn't achieved in this area at present and won't be fully achieved, although it may be much closer, but it won't be fully achieved even by 2030.
Thank you. Now, you also refer to Aviation 2050 on page 18 of your proof.
Yes.
And you produce an extract from paragraph 3.101 of Aviation 2050, which explains that the government expects airports to make the most of their regional influence to provide innovative solutions and incentives against ambitious targets which reduce carbon and congestion and improve air quality. Now, how do you interpret that paragraph, Dr. Bridfield?
Yes, so as in the following paragraph of my evidence, paragraph 51, I understand this to mean that airports should set ambitious targets to improve air quality, and I would expect those targets to focus on calculated airport emissions and or the calculated effects of those emissions on air quality from modelling studies and or trends in measured levels of air pollutants in the areas potentially affected by airport activities.
Thank you. It refers to the government expecting airports to provide innovative solutions and incentives against targets which reduce carbon and congestion and improve air quality. Yeah. What, in your view, do those last three words of that paragraph mean?
Well, I read these as being very consistent with the approach in aviation, the National Aviation Policy Framework, that airports should not just avoid significant impacts, but they should deliver improvements in air quality.
Okay. Now, Aviation 2050 came out in 2018, what air quality targets has Bristol Airport Limited set for itself, and are they ambitious?
Yes, so far as I'm aware, Bristol Airport has not set itself specific targets for air quality, and there's reference, which I refer to in my evidence and rebuttal, to some measures which it outlines as being designed to deliver improvements in air quality. I don't view these measures as ambitious. They don't appear to have ambition or detail around what will be carried out and what the benefits will result from these measures. So I don't view them as ambitious targets.
Okay. Fine. We'll come on to innovative solutions and incentives later. Now, so in terms then of where we get to on policy, let's move on to the NPPF, please. Now, you've provided extracts from old paragraph 170, 180 and 181. What changes has the new NPPF made to those paragraphs?
The new NPPF published recently doesn't change those
Right.
paragraphs, just the numbering has changed
It's
slightly.
only the number that changes. So 170's become 174, 180 has become 185, and 181 is 186, I think. I'm going to lead on that because we can all see it ourselves. I know, shocking, isn't it? Right, now, just if we look at paragraph 170, now 174, it explains that planning policies and decisions could contribute to enhance the natural and local environment by, and then at E it says preventing new and existing development from contributing to or being put at unacceptable risk or being adversely affected by unacceptable levels of air pollution. Development should, wherever possible, help improve local environmental conditions such as air and water quality. Now, how do you interpret that provision in the context of the present case?
So I read in PPF paragraph 170 to mean that there's a relatively low bar, first of all, that unacceptable levels of air pollution should be avoided, and that's fine and very normal. But in relation to air quality, it goes on to say that wherever possible, development should help to improve air quality. So there's an additional requirement in relation to air and water quality and other local environmental conditions that development should deliver an improvement where possible.
Now, what assessment of what is possible and what is not possible in terms of action to drive down emissions at Bristol Airport, either with or without the proposed development, have you seen?
I've seen no assessment.
Thank you. Now, we've also got on this page, you refer to paragraph 181, now 186, and we can see that refers to sustaining and contributing towards compliance with relevant limit values or national objectives for pollutions, taking into account the presence of AQMAs or clean air zones and the cumulative impacts on individual sites and local areas. It says opportunities to improve air quality or mitigate impacts should be identified, such as through traffic and travel management, green infrastructure provision and enhancement. Again, to date, what analysis of the opportunities to improve air quality associated and emissions associated with Bristol Airport have you seen?
Again, I've seen no analysis of improvements to air quality.
Okay. Thank you. So, given that there hasn't been an assessment of what is possible in terms of reductions of emissions from the airport, what opportunities there are. To what extent do you think the approach that's been adopted by Bristol Airport Limited is consistent with the MPPF?
I think that it is not consistent with this specific requirement that opportunities to improve air quality or mitigate impacts should be identified. There's been no focus on improving air quality, the first part of that requirement.
Yeah. Now, Mr. Pearce, in his evidence, says that, in essence, there can't be a requirement to improve emissions associated with airport expansion because an increase in throughput will always result in an increase in pollution. So, effectively, there's nothing you can do. What's your response to that suggestion?
I think that it's not an ambitious approach. I think there are steps that can be taken to improve the air quality impact of airport operations, and these could have been explored in more detail. It may be that when you look at all the different options that are available, you conclude that you can't improve air quality, in which case that I think is something that would have to be taken into account. It may be that when you do that assessment, you discover that you can improve air quality, in which case that would be a very positive and policy consistent outcome. So I think there are things that you can do. We're not just limited to saying, well, there's an increase in flight, so there's an increase in pollution.
So if it was suggested to you, well, your approach is that airport development always has to improve air quality, what would you say?
I mean, that is what national aviation policy says. There wasn't really a get-out clause in the national aviation policy documents that we just looked at. As regards national planning policy, there is a caveat which says that improvements should be delivered where possible. So I think it's a matter of how you balance those two requirements. But I think there is a case for saying that improvements have to be achieved, and that's what the national aviation policy says. If we're just looking at the planning policy, then that says that improvements have to be achieved where possible. So that does at least mean you have to look at them to see what is possible, and that's really what's been missing at the moment.
Right, thank you. All right. Now, we saw earlier that you were involved in the Stansted inquiry recently, which has led to the decision that we've got at CD 613. I just would like to take everybody to that, if I may, and to paragraph 60 on page 11. So CD 613, page 11. And myself too.
Lost my copy.
And we can see here in the decision letter, the inspectors referring to paragraph 170 of the MPPF and paragraph 181 that we've just been to. As we read through this decision, we can see what is said. But if we look at 60, 61 and 62, if it was suggested to you that the Stansted decision undermines the view that air quality improvements should be identified, what would you say?
I don't believe it does undermine that view. So firstly, in the Stansted decision, CD 613, paragraph 60, in the final sentence, the decision report says opportunities to improve air quality or mitigate impact should be identified. So that, I think, underlines the view that we were discussing a few minutes ago. Secondly, the Stansted decision, from my reading, does not engage with the commentary in Aviation Policy Framework or Aviation 2050, which clearly requires improvements in air quality to be identified. So whatever the reason for this, it does mean that we can't draw any conclusions from the Stansted decision as regards the requirements for air quality improvement in national aviation policy. Then thirdly, I would say that the Stansted decision in paragraph 62 concludes, and I quote, that the provisions of the unilateral undertaking would overall be likely to secure improvements in air quality. So again, from my reading, this must refer to improvements compared to the position without the unilateral undertaking, or improvements compared to the current situation. It cannot reflect the required comparison of the future situation with and without the proposed development, as no evidence to support this was presented at the Stansted inquiry. And fourthly, the Stansted decision in paragraph 61 concludes, and again I quote, "It will not be possible for all development to improve air quality." This was mentioned in the evidence of Mr. Pearce and Mr. Melling, and I deal with this in my rebuttal, paragraphs 17 to 21. But I think just to summarise that, what I'm saying there is that it's true that it's not possible for all development to improve air quality, but all development has a duty, I think, to improve air quality where possible. So you have to go through this process of seeing what can be done to improve air quality. And in regard to that planning policy, that's what's missing from the current application.
Right, thank you. Now, uncertainty associated with the fleet mix. Obviously, there's been discussion about uncertainty in the aviation forecast between Mr. Foley and Mr. Brass. And have you considered the alternative aviation fleet mix that was provided by Mr. Foley in INQ 10?
Yes, I have. I have assessed the updated fleet mix that Mr. Foley provided in document INQ 10, table 1. And this results in slightly different calculated emissions of air pollutants compared to those that would be reflected in the environmental statement addendum. Sorry, let me correct that. This results in slightly different calculated emissions compared to the information that was in Mr. Foley's original fleet mix. But those changes are too slight to change the findings that I set out in paragraph 100 of my evidence. Might just be worth perhaps reading that very briefly.
Yes, let's have a look at that. So that's on page 30.
Page 30.
I believe.
So I'll just read that. A sensitivity case highlighting the potential effects of increased numbers of flights by Jet 2 is set out in the evidence of Mr. Foley. An increase in the proportion of passengers carried by Jet 2 would result in an increase in emissions to air because of the typically older aircraft fleet used by Jet 2. Preliminary calculations using the data in my Appendix 1 indicate that a higher proportion of flights by Jet 2 compared to the mix of operators used to support the air quality assessments in the ES and ESA could result in an increase in emissions to air of particulate matter from the aircraft LTO cycle of approximately 16% in 2030 compared to the forecast made in the ES addendum. Emissions of oxides of nitrogen would also increase, although to a lesser extent. Thus, the fleet mix change that is likely to result from the commencement of operations by Jet 2 is likely to result in an increase in the air quality impact above that assessed in the ES and ESA. And then when I re-evaluated that in the light of the information in document INQ 10, I essentially reached the same conclusions. The numbers were slightly different, but I reached the same conclusions that there would be an approximately 16% increase in emissions of particulate matter and a smaller increase in emissions of oxides of nitrogen.
Okay, thank you. Now, just so that we can follow the implications of that through it's been said on behalf of Bristol Airport Limited that they propose the introduction of a noise contour cap. Aware of that?
Yes.
And that the fleet mix that Mr. Foley put forward couldn't operate within that contour cap. So if that contour cap were imposed and that the fleet mix that Mr. Foley's identified could not fly, what would the consequences be in terms of the emissions of particulate matter and NO2 compared to those which you've identified at paragraph 100?
I guess the effect of that would be to result in a position somewhere between what's in the ES addendum figures and the figures that I report in my paragraph 100 based on Mr. Foley's fleet mix. So the overall conclusion would be the same, that there would be an increase of somewhere between 0 and 16% in particulate matter emissions and a smaller increase in NOx emissions.
Thank you. Now, in your summary proof, please, we're going to turn on to look at the impacts of the proposed development now. In your summary proof, you address that in paragraphs 12 to 14. Can you just take us through those, please?
Yes. So this is where I deal with the air quality effects of the proposed development. The proposed development is forecast to result in a worsening of air quality due to increases in nitrogen dioxide and PM 2.5 levels. These forecasts are subject to uncertainty, for example, because of the timing of development and the aircraft fleet composition. As a result, impacts in practice may be greater than those forecast in the application. Because nitrogen dioxide and PM 2.5 have effects on health at levels within the current air quality standards, the forecast increase in levels of these pollutants at almost every location considered in the environmental statement would have an adverse effect on health. While it is not possible to quantify the precise extent of these increased risks, the development would result in an increase in risks to health, contrary to the requirements of national aviation policy, national planning policy, and the core strategy. The proposed development would also be likely to result in an increase in exposure to UFP, that's ultrafine particulate matter. This increase would be expected to result in associated increased risks to health, which would be at least partly additional to the risks posed by PM 2.5. It is currently not possible to quantify these increased risks. This combination of an unknown, unquantifiable risk with potentially serious effects on health, which lies outside the control of those affected, has many of the features of a risk that would give rise to a high level of concern or fear among members of the public. Again, this increased risks to health would be contrary to national and local policy. The assessment does not consider whether the combined effects of factors such as increased air pollution and noise could result in an impact which is greater than the individual effects. There remains the potential for interrelated effects on the health of the local population due to the proposed development, contrary to the core strategy.
All right, thank you. Now, just to reconfirm, please, that your views of the impact of the proposed development on health due to air pollution.
Yes, so any increase in air pollution would have an adverse effect on health. So there will be an adverse effect because there is forecast to be an increase in air pollution, and this includes an increased risk to health at an individual level. Any increase in exposure to ultrafine particulate matter would have an unquantified adverse effect on health, which may be partly included in the impacts due to larger fractions of particulate matter, for example PM 2.5, but there's no guarantee that it's wholly included in the impacts due to PM 2.5. So there will be an adverse effect on health due to ultrafine particulate matter, but we don't know how great this will be. These impacts could be completely or largely avoided by delivering an improvement in air quality, but the applicant has not done this, and nor have they sought to investigate this.
All right. So, in relation to ultrafine particles, given that your evidence is that there will be an adverse effect, but you don't know how great it is. What do you say is the appropriate mitigation response to address UFP?
Yes, so I have suggested a strategy that could be used to mitigate the unknown effects of ultrafine particulate matter, and that is to develop a mitigation that results in a reduction in emissions of PM2.5, which we can quantify. If we reduce emissions of PM2.5 or impacts due to PM2.5, then we would also expect to reduce whatever the impacts are due to ultrafine particulate matter. So that would be a strategy that you could use in the current situation where we don't have the tools to assess ultrafine particulate matter in detail.
All right, thank you. Now, mitigation measures generally, let's move on to deal with those. Mr. Pearce, in his proof at page 19, section 4.6 identifies mitigation measures, and he explains at 4.6.1 that two key mitigation measures are embedded in the appeal proposal that will directly reduce air quality impacts of expansion to 12 mppa, namely the realignment of roads at the junctions of Downside Road and West Lane with the A38, which he says will reduce the amount of traffic queuing, will in turn improve air quality at receptors near these sections of the road. That's the first one. The second one is the airport surface access strategy, which will increase the proportion of air passengers travelling by public transport instead of the car, with a target of 17.5% public transport mode share. He says that will improve air quality at receptors near roads with a significant amount of airport-related traffic. He explains that evidence about those measures will be given by Dr. Witchells. Look forward to that in September. And then lastly, further mitigation measures that will indirectly affect air quality are a commitment to be secured in the 106 agreement to develop an air quality action plan, coordinated with the Carbon and Climate Change Action Plan and the Airport Surface Access Strategy, which will, it says, help Bristol Airport Limited introduce further measures to reduce air quality impacts from the airport's operations. So now in terms of the effect of these mitigation measures upon the forecasts, have they been evaluated?
No, I think the only evaluation that I'm aware of is what I carried out in my own evidence.
Right.
And that's not a quantitative assessment, that's really just an in-principle assessment.
So I think if we go back to your summary, you reproduce in under paragraph 15 a table that appears in your proof.
Yes.
So it's table 1, page 5, under paragraph 15 of your summary. Can you just take us through that table, please?
Yes, so what I've done there is to look through all the measures that were identified in the application and in particular in the draft section 106 agreement that was under consideration at the time of the planning committee. And I've categorised the measures there in terms of their potential effect on air quality. So I found that none of the measures would deliver a quantifiable improvement in air quality. Two measures you would expect to deliver an improvement in air quality, but there's no information to enable these to be quantified, and or the benefits are not guaranteed. So that's the airport surface access strategy and the staff travel plan. I identified measures which would deliver an improvement in air quality, which is likely to be so small as to be insignificant, and the ultra-low emission strategy was in that category. There were some measures which were listed that would not deliver an improvement in air quality, and that is the Air Quality Action Plan, because that's a very reactive measure, and the Airport Environmental and Amenity Improvement Fund. And there were measures which would deliver a worsening in air quality, which were increased car parking provision and increase in flights. And finally, measures where it's not possible to evaluate their effect on air quality, and highway improvements fell into that category. So a range of measures, but none of which would deliver quantifiable improvements in air quality. Others may deliver an improvement or worsening.
Just on that last aspect, the highway improvements, which as we saw were prayed in aid, what assessment have you seen that looks at the with and without highway improvements impact on air quality in relation to properties adjacent to the roads where road improvements are proposed?
So in terms of the area where road improvements are proposed as part of this application, I have looked at the potential effects on air quality, in particular around the Downside Road junction area and along Downside Road to the north of the airport. And in fact, the effect on air quality in these areas is among the greatest impact forecast at any of the receptors considered. So there we see a worsening in air quality.
All right, thank you. Now, we saw, we can see in your proof, in your summary proof, again, it draws on what is in the proof inevitably, that you say at paragraph 17 of your summary that additional alternative measures are available which would enable the airport to improve air quality. So can you just take us through, please, the sorts of measures that you think should be considered?
Yes. So let me just read paragraph 17, where I say in my summary, additional or alternative measures are available which would enable the airport to improve air quality. Such measures could be designed and evaluated so as to deliver an improvement in air quality rather than a worsening of air quality, consistent with policy requirements. I suggest that the following measures should be considered to comprise a programme of innovative solutions and incentives against ambitious targets for this proposed development. And then I list, I think, 15 measures there that could be considered. I would say that I'm coming at this as an outsider as regards Bristol Airport, so this is a list of measures that I've taken from an industry document produced by an organisation that Bristol Airport is a member of, published in, I think, 2017, by Sustainable Aviation. So these measures were readily available for consideration by Bristol Airport Limited. It's possible that not all of them would have been applicable at Bristol Airport. Equally, it's possible that other measures may be applicable that I haven't listed here. But certainly this is what I would consider to be more consistent with an ambitious programme of measures to improve air quality.
All right, thank you. Now, Mr. Pearce, in his rebuttal, mentions the airport's draft carbon and climate change action plan and says that any of the measures in that plan will also have air quality benefits. First of all, the draft carbon and climate change action plan, when was that published?
According to the document itself, it was published in May 2021.
Right, so what consideration could have been given to it by members when they determined the application?
Clearly no consideration could have been given.
Right. Now, clearly it's marked as a draft, but what does it envisage by way of measures that would have air quality benefits?
So this carbon and climate change action plan lists a large number of measures targeted towards improving carbon and particularly carbon dioxide emissions and reducing the impact of the airport on climate change. So I've been through the measures that are set out in the tables in chapters 5, 6, 7 and 8 of this document. They refer to different aspects of the airport operations and cover short and medium-term measures for delivering improved climate change impacts. So there are 38 measures listed in those tables, according to my count, and I found that 16 of those would have no air quality benefit. A further 12 would have no more than a slight and essentially negligible benefit in the context of the impact of the proposed development on air quality. So there are some remaining measures which potentially have an air quality benefit, and these are aspirations for transition to lower emitting vehicle fleets, trials, reviews and encouragement of other parties to take action. So while some of these measures might ultimately be beneficial in improving air quality, I consider that they're broadly aspirational and lacking in commitment and or relying on cooperation from other parties. And I don't think they can be relied on to deliver improvements in air quality.
Okay, thank you. Now, think we, the last thing we need to do is to get you to draw your conclusions from your summary, please. Paragraph 18 onwards.
Yes. So this is my summary starting at paragraph 18, conclusions. The proposed development would result in increases in air pollution. These increases would present increased risks to health. The mitigation proposals proposed by the appellant as part of the planning application do not meet the policy requirements to improve air quality and do not consider the range of opportunities available to reduce emissions. None of the proposed measures would deliver a quantifiable improvement in air quality. Instead, the proposed measures deliver improvements which are unquantifiable, not guaranteed, negligible, or ineffective. I've set out a range of measures that could be viewed as more ambitious and which would assist in working towards delivering an improvement in air quality. However, because BAL has not been ambitious in its approach to delivering improvements in air quality and has not provided a carefully evaluated programme of ambitious targets and innovative solutions, the benefit of these proposals remains unassessed and unquantified. I conclude that national and local policy requires new airport development to deliver an improvement in air quality and an improvement in the health and well-being of the local population wherever possible. This is to be achieved by the adoption of ambitious targets and innovative solutions. The proposed development does not achieve these policy objectives. The proposed development will not contribute to improving the health and well-being of the local population. Rather, it will result in an increase in emissions of air pollutants and consequential increased risk to health. This would be contrary to policy CS3, CS23 and CS26 of the core strategy, contrary to the National Planning Policy Framework and contrary to national policy for airport development.
Dr. Brinfield, unless there's anything else you want to raise with the inspectors, those are all the questions.
No, there's nothing else. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think you've come in an hour early, Mr. Taylor.
Well, I'm trying my best.
Thank you. I think if I suggest we have a comfort break now, and then we'll proceed with cross-examination. So if we reconvene at 11:15, please. Okay, welcome back. Mr. Humphreys?
Dr. Broomfield, good morning.
Good morning.
Just start with a few preliminary things. You make very clear in your evidence that you were instructed after the decision to refuse. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And you weren't advising, obviously, therefore, before the council took its own advice, I think, on air quality matters, didn't it, in the lead up to the decision?
I was not involved at that stage, no.
No. And you drew attention to a whole number of changes since the decision. Obviously, none of those changes were matters that would have been known by the members when they rejected the professional advice of officers.
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. We do know, of course, from the officer's report, we can look at it if you want to, but maybe we can just agree it, that officers were content that the air quality methods used and the number and distribution of assessment locations provided a realistic projection of the impacts. There was no dispute between the parties.
No, there's no dispute about that, no.
And the results, which were summarised in the then environmental statement, were found to be acceptable.
Yes, I mean, there's a slight difference between acceptable in terms of we agree that they're reliable forecasts and acceptable in terms of what they mean and how they should be interpreted.
Yes,
Yeah.
acceptable in the context that officers recommended approval as well.
Yes, yes, officers recommended approval, yes.
So, and therefore, in that sense, they were acceptable. They could be accepted.
I mean, yes, although bearing in mind that there would have been a balancing act involved, I'm not quite sure to what degree they had to carry out that balance.
Understood. Public Health England, of course, were also a consultee, weren't they? Because there was a health impact assessment, they would have been a statutory consultee.
Yes, that's correct.
Can we just look at what they thought about the assessment? So we need CD 19.12.
Okay, I haven't got that far through your list yet, so...
Do you have access to the documents
I
just
do,
through
yes.
the library?
Please just give me a minute and I'll find it. Yeah.
We, or indeed my colleagues, been assiduously producing these lists. I don't think anyone's actually looked at one yet.
Well,
So
I got it about 4 minutes ago, so...
No, exactly. It's easiest just to look them up on the list, I think. There are.
That's what I'm doing.
The
Yes,
inspectors
I have
looked
it
at
now.
one.
There we go.
I have it now.
But had to take it out from under a pile of things to do so.
Didn't know it was there.
So 19.12. And this is obviously commenting on the original environmental statement, and indeed as you told us in your evidence in chief, the effect of the changes that you identified have actually resulted in lower levels of forecast pollution, my shorthand.
Yes.
And this is what Public Health England thought. So in that document on the first page, under the emboldened heading 1, General Approach, it says the submitted ES appears to use national and industry good practice. We note that in cases where there is no specific guidance, such as the assessment of air quality impacts from airports, a reasonable approach has been taken. And you probably don't disagree with that, I take it.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the methods used for calculating emissions and calculating air pollution impacts and concentrations, I would agree with that.
Yes, and on the second page, there's a heading 2, emissions to atmosphere, third paragraph under that heading. It says, during the operation of the airport, we agree that the major pollutants of concern are nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter, PM10, PM2.5. We agree with the approach taken in the air quality assessment. And again, we can see, therefore, that Public Health England have identified the major pollutants of concern. And again, you probably agree with that.
I agree that NO2 and PM particulate matter are the major pollutants of concern. As you'll see from my evidence, we've also considered that ultrafine particulate matter is relevant.
Yes. Well, we can come to that a little bit later. And we can see in the following paragraph there's comments on the actual results. I won't look at those because we know in the ES addendum the results have slightly changed, they're now lower.
Now slightly lower.
The inspectors can see what Public Health England clearly thought at the time. The assessment is also agreed, isn't it? Is also consistent, isn't it, with the Council's scoping opinion?
Yes, it is. And just going back to that final paragraph that you mentioned, I note that in this letter, Public Health England are commenting on nitrogen dioxide concentrations. They don't make any comment on particulate matter levels. I don't think we should read in that they're concerned about particulate matter levels. To me, that suggests that they're perhaps just a little less familiar with dealing with air pollution impacts. I think if they had been, they would have been focusing equally on PM10 and PM2.5 in this evaluation.
I mean, we have no evidence whatsoever, do we, to suggest that Public Health England are not aware of particulate matter as a health issue.
No, I agree,
No
and absolutely right, and they mention it in the previous paragraph, but they don't follow through in the following paragraph, and that to me is that is a surprising omission, I think, given the focus on the effects of PM2.5 in terms of their effects on health. So I think, as I said, that to me suggests, and it is speculation, you're right, but it suggests that maybe they're just not as familiar with dealing with these topics.
Yes. May indicate that they were just completely satisfied. There was nothing to draw attention to. We could speculate on that too if you wanted.
We could do, but they did flag it in the previous paragraph, and it is a more significant, substantial air pollution issue in the UK generally.
Now, as far as the scoping opinion is concerned, we can go to it if you want, but or I can just give you the reference and tell you what it says, and we can hopefully agree that. The scoping opinion indicates that the scope and methodology for assessment of air quality is acceptable.
Yes, it does, yes.
And I'll give the inspectors the note. It's CD 4.9, page 10, row 7.
The inquiry notes, we couldn't go to it because it's not actually in the library. So,
That's interesting. I have got it and I have downloaded
okay.
it.
Well,
Okay.
No, maybe you're not wrong, but I've got it with the right number, so I've obviously downloaded
We'll get
it.
that checked and get it on.
CD 4.9. Yeah, okay. Mr. Broomfield, again, slightly later in your evidence, you relate two issues and relating to health, and we've got later this week a witness on public health issues. I think in fairness, you don't hold yourself out as a public health expert. You're an air quality expert and you would input to public health. Would that be fair?
That's correct. Yes, I'm not a public health expert, but I have dealt with the health consequences of exposure to air pollution.
That's absolutely fair. You don't, for example, you don't publish in the Faculty of Public Health publications or anything of that sort? No,
I do not.
You were the witness for the counsel at the Stansted appeal, and Mr. Taylor took you to some of the paragraphs there, and my understanding is you, in effect, disagree with some of the conclusions of the inspectors.
I find that the inspector's report doesn't address some of the points that were covered at the inquiry. Yes. I mean, that's obviously their prerogative. I also found that the inspector's report is referring to, when it's looking at air quality improvements, the topic that we discussed at some length this morning, that they are referring to what I believe to be an incorrect comparison. And we didn't go into that in detail at the Stansted inquiry, and I hadn't realised that there was perhaps this misapprehension going on at the time until I saw the inspector's report.
You raised at that inquiry very similar arguments to those that you raise here. I've seen your evidence from that. It was online.
Yes, it's similar. Not identical, of course.
And you've given your characterisation of the inspectors. Another characterisation was they just didn't agree with your approach, your assessment.
Well, I think if they hadn't agreed with it, I'm sure they would have put it in their report, but they don't appear to have done so.
All right. We'll come back to some of the points, obviously, that you raised. I just want to talk about some points now related to air quality modelling, subject to the fleet mix issue. My understanding is that you agree, or the parties agree, that the air quality modelling results have been calculated correctly.
Yes, I think that's covered in the Statement of Common Ground.
It is. It's in. It doesn't have. I don't think it has a CD number because it's a sort of evolving document. But I think it's recorded there that the quantification of impacts is appropriate and robust.
Yes.
As far as fleet mix is concerned, obviously which fleet mix is correct is not a matter for you, that's for the forecasters. But the inspectors asked the airport to produce, both for noise and for air quality, a note saying, or setting out whether the use of Mr. Foley's revised forecast. I think this morning there was a reference to INQ 10. I think the ball stopped rolling at INQ 18, actually.
Okay.
But,
I haven't looked at INQ 18. I have looked at INQ 10.
Ah, okay. But have you seen the note that was circulated a few days ago from Mr. Pearce?
Yes, I have.
And what that shows is that actually what we call the Foley revised fleet mix makes very little difference to the air quality results.
Yes, I've had a look at that. And so firstly, just to say that I think the fleet mix that's referred to in the note from Mr. Pearce is the same as the fleet mix that's in INQ 10 that I looked at. So that's
it may
a good
be, it
start.
depends which column you're looking at.
Okay. It's the same one that I looked at anyway. And Mr. Pearce concludes that using if we can say Mr. Foley's forecasts results in a slight decrease in NOx emissions and impacts and a slight increase in PM 2.5 impacts and emissions. So I reached a slightly different conclusion, which was that it led to a slight increase in both of those aspects, but I think we're talking quite marginal differences there, so I don't think it's going to be very productive to try and track back to work out what those differences are.
Okay.
But I agree that, so I think we can conclude from this that the forecasts are similar, particularly in this note is looking at modelled concentrations, not in terms of calculated emissions. So the impacts are much are less because there's many other things going on.
So it could be a slight difference between you, but not a material difference.
No, I think not a material difference.
Okay. And again, in your evidence in chief, you were asked a question about if there was no Foley alternative, and we were just looking at Mr. Brass, i.e. the airport's fleet mix, in relation to that, as I understand it, for the reasons we discussed above in relation to the statement of common ground, you accept the results of the modelling if Mr. Brass's fleet mix, the airport's fleet mix, is correct?
I do, yes.
Yeah, that's helpful. So if we come then to the areas of dispute, I've sort of, in my mind, put fleet mix now to one side. There are two, perhaps, principal remaining areas of dispute. One relates to the evaluation of the results, in other words, what they mean and the criteria for doing so. You set that out in your evidence. And the other relates to ultrafine particles. Is that a fair characterization? I'm not trying to catch you out,
Yep,
but just
no,
trying
I
to...
think that's fair, yes.
Okay. Can we start, before we look at those things, just looking at some of the legal and policy points? In your written evidence, but also in your evidence in chief, you took the inspectors to your paragraph 29 through to 33, which deal with the treaty founding the European Economic Community and also the Air Quality Directive. Can we agree that those treaties and directives are no longer part of UK law? They're not retained EU law under the Withdrawal Agreement 2018. Okay. I thought that would be fairly common ground. The Withdrawal Act 2018 is pretty clear about what is, but let's leave it if that's...
I'm happy for him to answer it. Okay, I'll make my submissions anyway.
Okay. I mean, if you don't know, Dr. Broomfield, I'm not trying to catch you out. I just assume this would be completely common ground.
The answer is I can't speak with any authority on that, so
Okay.
I won't answer.
All right. Clearly what you have done, as you explained in your evidence in chief, though, based on the original EU treaty and the Air Quality Directive, and is to draw certain points. You talked about the hierarchy and all of those things. Again, I don't want to catch you out on a legal question, but you haven't pointed to any domestic regulations that make those same points. Is that because there wasn't anything you wanted to draw attention to?
No, I haven't pointed to domestic regulations. I've included this material because it sets the context for the national air quality policy and national planning policy and aviation policy, and it presents a consistent view. So I felt it was useful to include that context.
Clearly, things like the Clean Air Strategy 2019, post-date the Withdrawal Act 2018, but again, maybe that's getting into legal things, and I'm very happy to leave that.
It does, yes.
All right. And you drew attention also, your paragraph 41, to the aviation policy framework, and paragraph 3.51, you read that, we can read it, but you drew attention to the airports being generators of surface transport journeys and sharing responsibility to minimize impact. But we know from looking at that document more generally in previous sessions that there's nothing in that document, is there, that precludes or prevents the expansion of airports. Indeed, quite the contrary, it includes a making best use policy.
Yes, as far as I'm aware, there's nothing there that precludes expansion, but there is also this requirement to improve air quality. So those two things go together.
Yes, I mean, the requirement is share a responsibility for minimizing air quality impact of these operations, i.e. surface transport journeys.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the statement is generic. It just says improve air quality, but it is following a sentence around surface transport, which is the major impact.
Again, just staying on this theme of sort of legal and policy points, the air quality standards and the air quality objectives, let's just unpack that slightly. So the air quality standards, I'm sure the inspectors will be familiar with this. The air quality standards are set out in regulations, aren't they? So yes. The standards are the legal standards, and we have the standards. I'm going to take you to it just so that it helps the inspectors kind of know where it is. So if we look at CD 8.3, we can see those are the UK.
Sorry, I went to CD 8.4 by mistake.
8.3. Yeah. So and if we want to look in those and understand something about the way it works, if we look at PDF page 7, we get regulation 17, and again, if there's anything, I imagine this is bread and butter for you, but if I take you to anything legal that you're not comfortable.
No, I'm familiar with this, thank you.
I assumed you would be. So regulation 17 is the duty on the Secretary of State in relation to what are called limit values, and that is a set of language that comes from the directive. And it tells us that the limit values are set out in Schedule 2. And so if we go to PDF page 15, we get the limit values, which are the air quality standards, don't we, for various different pollutants. And we can see the second one in the schedule is nitrogen dioxide, and that's where we get the 40 micrograms per meter cubed calendar year, and you can see the level a bit further down for PM10s, again calendar year 40 micrograms per meter cubed, and for PM2.5s the limit value 25 micrograms per meter cubed. So those are the air quality standards.
They are, yes. And
then the way in which it works in the UK, when we talk about air quality objectives, those are set out in policy, aren't they?
Yes, that's right.
And that's the Air Quality Strategy 2007.
Yes.
And we've got that at CD 8.2.1. And this is a DEFRA policy document, and again, the table, I'm afraid, is sideways, so it's not very useful, but on the screen. But if we were to look at that table that starts on PDF page 20, we would again see the standards that we looked at reflected in policy, and those are in effect, the air quality objectives. You can see the top of the title to the chapter 2 on PDF page 22, air quality objectives and pollutants. Yeah?
Yes, and that's the heading for that table as well.
Exactly. Now, those are the legal requirements and the policy objectives. And we can see what they are, and we agree, don't we, that the air quality assessment undertaken by the airport has, amongst other things, assessed the effects against those standards and objectives.
Yes, that's been done, yes.
You draw attention, however, also, very properly, to the Clean Air Strategy 2019. And we ought to just touch on that to see how that relates to the standards and objectives. And that's CD 8.7. And we can see that document just for form's sake. Obviously, we know that this strategy came out after the environmental statement was published, which is why it's not referred to in the environmental statement. Yes. But there was a, the council, when it came out, asked the airport to comment on this in a Regulation 25 request, didn't they?
I don't specifically recall that, but I'm sure you're right.
And so the airport did in a document, we don't, again, need to look it up, but it's, for reference, it's CD 3.4.10 is the Regulation 25 response, where the airport took into account the Clean Air Strategy. So this was before the application was determined. Yeah? You don't know?
I don't recall the details of that document. I'm happy to look at it and see what it says.
Okay. Let's have a look in here at page 15.
So are we looking at the Clean Air Strategy or at the...
We're looking at the Clean Air Strategy.
Yeah, okay.
And a number of points there. It starts in the text by referring to the statutory obligations that exist. It refers to the national emission reduction commitments in relation to 5 pollutants, including PM 2.5s. We should note not ultrafine particles.
Correct, they're not referenced there.
It makes it clear our emission targets, set ambitious reduction goals, sets out what those are, and then towards the bottom in bold, this strategy sets out existing policies and a program for new actions that would help us meet these targets. Information about the individual pollutants and how they interact is set out in the following pages. So we can see there, can't we, for the Clean Air Strategy, what the focus is in terms of the pollutants, and in the box on the right-hand side, again, we see the reference to NO2, PM10 and PM2.5, but not ultrafine particles.
No, ultrafine particles aren't mentioned here.
And if we just go back to page 7, this is the passage in the left-hand column. It's the sort of slightly indented, emboldened passage about 2/3 of the way down, which you've referred to. It says we will progressively cut public exposure to particulate matter pollution as suggested by the WHO we will set a new ambitious long-term target to reduce people's exposure to PM2.5 and will publish evidence early in 2019 to examine what action would be needed to meet the WHO annual mean guideline of 10 micrograms per metre cube. By implementing the policies in this strategy, we will reduce PM2.5 concentrations across the UK so that the number of people living in locations above the WHO guideline level of 10 micrograms per metre cubed is reduced by 50% by 2025. Now, a number of points to note here. First, the Clean Air Strategy itself does not amend, does it, the air quality standards or the air quality objectives? No new standard or objective has been set.
No, it's mapping a pathway towards, which is based on the WHO guideline level, but it doesn't set that as a new standard.
Okay. There's a commitment to set a new standard, but that new standard hasn't been set. It was originally going to be in 2019. I imagine a number of other things have slightly intervened, but there is no new standard, no new objective. That's fair, isn't it?
That's correct.
The WHO PM2.5 level, the 10 micrograms per metre cubed, is not adopted as a new air quality standard or objective.
No, it's not. No.
And
it is adopted as a target that the government is seeking to work towards and build policy around.
At a national level, it's not suggested that WHO figure is a development control threshold for individual projects, is it?
It's not, no.
No. The WHO guideline has no status, does it, in UK law or policy, other than this, in effect, this mention here?
It doesn't have any status in law. In terms of policy, I couldn't be sure it doesn't appear somewhere else, but certainly it does appear in this document as being a reference point for policy. Yeah.
Yes. And what we do know as well, because in the passage of the Environment Bill, which is currently going through Parliament, there is the potential there to set a new target, isn't there?
There is.
We know in relation to that, again, that no target has been set currently.
That's correct, as far as I'm aware. Yeah.
And in the recent COMIAP document, which we have as INQ 029, again, I'm sure you're familiar with it. We may not need to look it up. But again, that document is making recommendations on a potential target for the Environment Bill. Let's have a look at it, INQ 029. So it's the Committee on the Medical Effects of Air Pollutants, advice on health evidence relevant to setting PM2.5 targets. We know there, don't we, that, I mean, we can look in the document if you like, page 12, but the COMIAP do not recommend a particular new target, and they certainly don't recommend that it is the WHO figure. Is that fair? But if you look at page 12,
yeah.
And you look just before the sort of unindented paragraph towards the bottom, B2 Roman 3, the paragraph above that. So the current evidence suggests that continuing to reduce concentrations of P2.5, this is below the existing 25 standard, even where exposures are already quite low, would be expected to have a benefit to public health. Assuming no threshold for effects within the current studied range of PM 2.5 concentrations, the health evidence alone is not sufficient to define the concentrations at which targets should be set. Targets could therefore be defined in terms of the costs and benefits of achieving them, if this can be undertaken in a rigorous fashion in time to inform the derivation of the targets. This approach would help to ensure that the investment required to meet the air quality targets is proportionate to the benefit gained, and that it would not inappropriately consume resources that could achieve more public benefit if they were invested to address other problems. So the issue is recognised, but again, COMIAP have not recommended any alternative standard or objective, have they?
No, they haven't. No, I mean, they're noting that the impacts are real and potentially significant, but they haven't recommended a specific assessment threshold.
You say in your paragraph 43 that recent moves towards a much more demanding air quality standard for PM 2.5 set out in the air quality strategy means that the APF is out of date.
Let's just finish that sentence. Sorry. It's out of date in relation to its consideration of particulate matter. Sorry. Thank you.
Yes. So we can see, can't we, that firstly, the clean air strategy and indeed COMIAP themselves don't change the standards or objectives, so the airport policy framework is not out of date in that particular regard.
Correct.
And we looked in the air quality standard at the main pollutants that it said it was concerned with, not including, as we agreed, ultrafine particles. And again, it's not possible, certainly at this stage, is it, to suggest that the airport policy framework is out of date in relation to that either, because the position is inconclusive?
No, I mean, the section of the aviation policy framework I'm specifically referring to is where it says that particulate matter limits are largely met. And in that regard, I think it's no longer appropriate to consider that particulate matter should not be a priority in the way the aviation policy framework then focuses on NOx, whereas I think we should continue to focus on both NOx and particulate matter.
Yes. Obviously, the airport policy framework we know is from 2013. Sound to be correct, I think it's 2013. And clearly air quality has improved enormously since then, hasn't it?
Yes, air quality has improved enormously, and also our understanding of the effects of air pollution has improved.
And so, insofar as the airport policy framework might have been saying, as at 2013, that the standards had been largely met, we can say now that they've been met to an even greater extent.
Yes, I'm not arguing that the levels are high, or that those standards are not met for some reason. I'm saying that it's to do with the fact that the aviation policy framework just focuses on oxides of nitrogen and doesn't consider particulate matter further, whereas I think there's a strong case in view of the importance of airborne particulate matter for public health to continue to focus on it.
Certainly,
and indeed, that was the approach that was. That was the approach that was agreed by Bristol Airport Limited and officers when setting out the environmental statement.
What we do know, though, is that what the airport then did as a result of, obviously, comments about the WHO standard was that in the environmental statement addendum, it then identified the WHO guideline for PM 2.5, so the 10 micrograms. It identified it as a secondary criterion in assessing results.
Yes.
And let's just look at that. So CD 2.20.1. and we need to just turn to, I think it'll be PDF page 98. From recollection, it's the bottom of page 98. Yeah. So we can see there in paragraph 7.6.8, that since the original ES was submitted, there has been increased interest in and concern about the impacts of PM 2.5, for example, in the Clean Air Strategy and the Environment Bill. Current legislation and policy guidance is focused on the assessment level of 25 micrograms as an annual mean, so this is the primary criterion against which concentrations have been assessed. And then in the next paragraph, it talks about the WHO guidance, and right at the very bottom of that page, beginning of the next, it says, in the light of this, annual mean PM 2.5 concentrations have also been compared against the level of 10 micrograms as a secondary criterion, but it should be borne in mind that this is not the current policy, and that's fair, isn't it? It's not current policy, and they did carry out that assessment.
Well, I think achieving that standard or that guideline is not current policy, but that guideline is very definitely part of current policy. It's influencing where the government policy will go.
We've gone through that. The inspectors will be able to form a conclusion about what role it has. But we can see that far from ignoring it, the environmental statement addendum specifically took it into account, and we'll look at the results later.
Indeed, and I acknowledged that in chief earlier.
Now, in Aviation 2050, in your paragraph 50, you identified paragraph 3.101, which is the paragraph that refers to innovative solutions and incentives and ambitious targets. And you, both in your original proof of evidence and indeed also in your rebuttal evidence and also in your evidence in chief, have emphasized very strongly, haven't you, this point about ambitious targets?
Yes, I mean, I have done, and I use that because that seems to me the guidance that's provided in policy for how you should deliver the improvements in air quality.
And one of the things that you said in your evidence in chief is that the airport hadn't set itself ambitious air quality targets, and I took that as being a criticism.
Yes, that's correct.
That paragraph 3.101 and the ambitious targets is of course referring to not air quality targets but public transport mode share targets, isn't it?
Well, it's saying that it refers to ambitious targets which reduce carbon and congestion and improve air quality. So I read that as being ambitious targets to improve air quality.
Let's look at the paragraph in context.
Yes, and I think that it is in the major impact of airports is on air quality is associated with their surface access. So that is a big part of this.
It would be wrong, wouldn't it, for the inspectors to go away with the impression that that's talking about ambitious air quality targets. We would surely, between us, want them to properly understand what it's referring to. So let's go to CD 6.5, and let's start on PDF page 76. And towards the bottom of PDF page 76, there's a section that starts sustainable journeys to the airport.
I'm some way behind you at the moment.
Don't worry, I do apologise. I'm only asking this because so much of your case seems to be based on us not having provided ambitious air quality targets.
Could you give me the page reference, please?
Yes, PDF page 76.
Thank you.
6.5, CD 6.5. So let's just go through the paragraphs that end up with the one that you've looked at. So 3.98, so this is a section on sustainable transport. The government's ambition is to put the UK at the forefront of design and manufacture of zero-emission vehicles. Talks then about investment in that and so on. Then 3.99, the government's expectation is that airports, through their surface access strategies, set targets, underline, for sustainable passenger and staff travel to the airport, which meet, where possible, the ambitions set by government, and these, for these to be monitored by their respective airport transport forums. And then, next paragraph, the government's analysis shows that by 2050, although there are expected to be 70% more surface access journeys as a result of increased aviation demand, developments already in the pipeline, such as cleaner engine technology, electrification of cars, decarbonisation of rail, could keep surface transport carbon emissions at similar levels today, unless airports also deliver more ambitious mode share targets. Then you come to your quote, the government expects the airport to make the most of their regional influence, that now becomes comprehensible, to provide innovative solutions and incentives against ambitious targets which reduce carbon and congestion and improve air quality. Now, read in context, it's absolutely clear, isn't it, that the ambitious targets are mode share targets. And that's why they talk about regional influence, and they talk above about various wider strategies. That's fair, isn't it?
This is certainly in the section that deals with sustainable transport.
I can see that from the heading. It's fair, isn't it, that the ambitious targets are surface access targets. There are two references to that in the preceding paragraphs.
I agree that will certainly be an important component. I think there are other aspects of surface transport that are also relevant to improving air quality potentially. So, yes. For example, so that includes surface access strategy, includes staff travel plan. There are other aspects that you could also consider to deliver the same outcomes.
Yes, and the innovative solutions and incentives are again to do with public transport mode share. We'll come to this in the topic after the break, the highway topic, the surface access topic. But innovative solutions and incentives relate to public transport mode shares.
No, not entirely. It also refers to staff travel in 399, so that's not.
Well, staff travel is also public transport mode share, isn't it?
Okay, I mean, my interpretation of public transport was members of the public travelling to the airport to fly, but as long as we're clear, that includes staff travel as well. It also refers in the paragraph 398 to plug-in vehicles and steams to support charge point infrastructure. So it's saying that provision of electrical charging infrastructure is also an important part.
There is no requirement in this policy, is there, for the airport to have set itself an air quality target against which you now say it has failed in some sort of policy duty. There's no duty, is there?
Well, a target can be expressed in many different ways, so I'd say yes.
There is no duty, is there, for the airport to set an air quality target based on this paragraph?
There isn't a duty on the airport to set a target, and you could define an air quality target as a target set in terms of air pollution concentrations or emissions. You could also set a target in terms of other parameters that relate to, for example, sustainable transport, so yes. Changes in mode share or provision of electric infrastructure uptake, changes in car parking provision. There are a number of ways that those targets could be set.
All sorts of things that one could do, as you put
Yes.
it. What I was just trying to get clear for the inspectors is whether this paragraph in Aviation 2050 sets some sort of requirement or expectation on the airport to set an air quality target against which you say we have failed. And I think the answer must be no.
I think the answer is that there is a requirement to set a target which improves air quality. That target could then be expressed in many different ways. So it may be expressed as an effect on air pollution emissions or concentrations, or it may be expressed in different terms that relate to the details of the measures that you're looking to take.
I think I've asked the question 3 times. I remember once being told by one of the chief inspectors 3 times was the limit. We do know, don't we, for surface access and public transport that a target has been set.
A target has been set, yes.
All right. In the NPPF, so CD 5.8.1, that's what I've got as the number of the new NPPF. I don't know whether everyone else has. 5.8 was the original NPPF. I just assumed the updated one was 0.1. Do you have that?
I'm just getting there now. sorry, could you give me the reference again?
I think it's 5.8.1. I mean, what we could do is, I don't think the paragraph numbers have changed. We could use the original version and
I don't see a 5.8.1 here. So.
Do you have it?
I don't. No, it doesn't appear to be on. I'm not seeing it on the website here.
Don't worry. My ability to take you to the correct PDF page is now going to be a little bit more limited, I'm afraid, because I've got all my references on the new document. But I think we're going to be around page 48, 49. Maybe.
So should I open the 2019 version?
Yes. Why
Okay.
why don't you do that? And I think we're in paragraph 170, which is on PDF page 51.
Yes, I've got that.
And again, just trying to understand the policy context. So it starts planning policies and decisions, which obviously we're involved in here, should contribute to and enhance the natural and local environment by, and then it's E, isn't it? Preventing new and existing development from contributing to, being put at unacceptable risk from, or being adversely affected by unacceptable levels of air pollution. Development should, wherever possible, help to improve the local environment, environmental conditions such as air quality, taking into account relevant information. So we need to just record, don't we, there, that the injunction to improve is a qualified one. It's where possible. It's not a hard and fast rule. Indeed, that's what the Stansted inspectors found.
I agree, yes, the planning policy here includes the caveat of wherever possible.
And again, if we try and convert new money back to old money, I think we go to paragraph 181. So this is 186 in the new document, but I think it's back in 181. So PDF page 54. Planning policies and decisions should sustain and contribute towards compliance with relevant limit values or national objectives for pollutants. So first of all, limit values or national objectives. The limit values are the air quality standards and the objectives are the air quality objectives, aren't they?
That's correct.
And I think it's common ground between us here that around the airport there is compliance, so there's no need to contribute towards compliance, so it's a question of sustaining compliance, isn't it?
As far as that that sentence goes, yes, that's correct.
And I don't think, again, we'll come to the results, but I don't think you're suggesting in any case there is any receptor that is currently compliant that would become non-compliant as a result of the effects of the development.
There's no suggestion of that.
And again, that qualified injunction to improve is also reflected, isn't it, in the PPG? So we've looked at the NPPF. It's also reflected in the PPG, isn't it? The Planning Policy Guidance.
Do you mean the practice guidance?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes. Yes.
I sort of slightly revert sometimes to old
Yeah.
money. So
That's
apologise.
old money, yes.
So let's look at 8.26. I haven't started referring to pounds, shillings and pence yet, Dr. Broomfield, but that's only a matter of time. So in that document, again, it's not easy, but I think on PDF page 3, that's paragraph 2, and I think right at the top of that page, it says all development plans can influence air quality in a number of ways, for example, through what development is proposed and where, and the provision for sustainable transport, consideration of air quality decision making. Sorry, maybe for various reasons I don't seem to be able to mark this document up, but there's a section in there that you quote, I think, at your paragraph 59. Maybe that's the easiest way of looking at it, where you say consideration of air quality issues. In fact, it is the bit I read out. At planning making stage can ensure strategic approach to air quality and help secure overall improvements, and that and again, we can see, can't we, in your paragraph 59, the quote that we have at the top of PDF page 3, that's again qualified by the words "where possible," recognition that this is not an absolute requirement.
That's correct, yes. I think it's important to note that in this sentence refers to setting the context for delivering improvements in air quality, and that I think has helped to inform North Somerset Council's approach to improving to its own planning policies that also seek to deliver improvements, particularly in public health. So I think in that sense, this requirement for a strategic approach in development plans has been worked through to local planning policy and development planning.
And if I move us on to paragraph 008, which is on PDF page 7, we get this advice, don't we, under the heading, how can an impact on air quality be mitigated? Mitigation options will need to be locationally specific, will depend on the proposed development, and need to be proportionate to the likely impact. So when the inspectors are looking, as we will do, at the impacts and the characterization of the impacts, it's important, isn't it, that they recognize that the mitigation of that needs to be proportionate?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, I think this reference to mitigation here does refer back to the planning policy framework, the old number 181, the new 186, where we're talking about compliance with limit values. So that's talking about mitigating impacts to avoid non-compliance. But that paragraph does go on to refer to opportunities to improve air quality or mitigate impacts should be identified. So I'm not sure that refers to the matter of improving air quality. It seems to me that refers more to the mitigating impacts aspect of NPPF paragraph 181.
And let's just then, while we're still trying to finish off this theme on the policy context for air quality, just touch on the core strategy, which I've got as CD 520. And in there are three policies that are prayed in aid by the Council. The first is CS3, so this is CD 5.20 and CS3, which is on page 33.
Yes, I'm there.
Okay. And this tells us that development that on its own or cumulatively would result in air, water or other environmental pollution or harm to amenity, health or safety will only be permitted if the potential adverse effects would be mitigated to an acceptable level by other control regimes or by measures included in the proposals by the imposition of planning conditions or a planning obligation. So to judge ourselves against this policy, we have to see, don't we, whether the harm is at an acceptable level.
Yes, I think so.
And that's obviously going to form a judgment. There isn't any set threshold either in the plan or anywhere else that says, look, this level is acceptable or not acceptable.
Yes, I'm just looking at my evidence, paragraph 134 and 135. So this highlights that policy CS3 confirms that new development will only be permitted if the resulting air pollution or harm to amenity or health would be mitigated to an acceptable level, which is the sentence you just pointed us to. And then in 135, I say that I consider that those policies CS3 and CS23 need to be read in the context of policy CS26 and national policy.
Yes. So obviously one threshold of acceptability would be compliance with the air quality standards and the air quality objectives.
Yes, that's definitely right.
And we're obviously going to examine, of course, what happens at below those levels. The point I was putting to you, there's nothing in the plan itself that says, look, this is acceptable and something else is unacceptable. It's a judgment.
It is, yes, it's a judgment, and that's really why I linked those three policies together to where there's a little bit more guidance on that in CS26.
We'll come on to that one in a moment.
Yes.
So page 97, we get to CS23. Page 97, CS93. And there we can see, again, the language involves a judgment. Proposals for the development of Bristol Airport will be required to demonstrate the satisfactory resolution of environmental issues, including the impact of growth on surrounding communities and surface access infrastructure. And again, there's no threshold, is there, for what is a satisfactory resolution? The inspectors clearly are going to have to look at the effects of the development for judgment.
Yes, that's correct. And again, that's also covered in paragraphs 134 and 135 of my evidence.
And then the final one, I think, is on page 102. This is the one you just drew attention to, CS 26. And this is a policy about supporting healthy living and the provision of healthcare facilities. And it says the planning process will support programs and strategies which increase and improve health services throughout the district and promote healthier lifestyles and aim to reduce health inequalities. So we'll come on to the sub-points, but this is a policy, isn't it, about healthy lifestyles and so on.
Yes, it is.
And certainly officers, we can come to it in a minute, officers in the officers' report thought this was of limited relevance, didn't they, to the decision?
I don't specifically recall, but I've no reason to doubt what you say.
We can perhaps come back to that in a moment. How are these healthier lifestyles going to be achieved? And the first is requiring health impact assessment on all large-scale developments in the district that assess how the development will contribute to improving the health and well-being of the populations. And the requirement there is for there to be a health impact assessment, isn't there? Health impact assessments do assess how development will contribute to improving health, but the requirement is to provide a health impact assessment.
Yes, the requirement is for a health impact assessment, but it's implicit in what it says. If that was all that it was, then I think it would have stopped at that point. But it's implicit here that the health impact assessment, or that the development, will contribute to improving the health and well-being of the local population. I don't think there's any value on just having a health impact assessment unless that has some practical outworking benefit. So I've interpreted this CS 26.1 as being in principle, development should in North Somerset should contribute to improving health and well-being.
Should we see how the plan interprets it rather than how you interpret it? Turn on to PDF page 104, and we can see paragraph 3.320. And it says there, it starts by describing what health impact assessments are. Health impact assessments are an important tool used to assess how development proposals will contribute to improving the health and well-being of local populations and end users of the scheme. Public health authorities and developers alike increasingly need to consider how policies, strategies or development will impact on health and health inequalities. A health impact assessment can identify potential health gains and potential risks to health to help to identify additional measures to reduce or avoid these. This policy requires a health impact assessment to be submitted with the applications for all major developments within the district. It's clear, isn't it, that it's describing what a health impact assessment is, but what the policy requirement is the policy requires a health impact assessment to be submitted. It would be odd, wouldn't it, to tuck away in a policy on healthy lifestyles a major strategy on requiring all development to improve health.
I don't know whether it will be odd or not. I mean, I agree that the requirement is to submit a health impact assessment, but if we just go back to the preceding sentence, it's talking about identifying health gains and risks to health and identifying additional measures that will, for example, reduce or indeed avoid these risks. So it seems implicit to me that That's the starting point for the local policy, that risks should be reduced or avoided, and that is consistent with the national picture that we've been discussing.
And let's just look at the officers' reports to just, you can look at both the original one and then the subsequent one. So CD 411, just to see what officers understood about their own plan. So CD 4.11, let's turn to page 6. Page 6 lists, sort of starts sort of about in the middle of the page, the most relevant policies. And CD 26 doesn't even make the list of the most relevant policies, does it?
It's not there, no.
No. And let's just then look at the slightly later report when they were looking at the reasons for refusal. So CD 4.13. So reason for refusal 3. Policy CS 26 is referred to...
Could you give me a page number, please?
Yes, of course. Page 5.
Thank you. Yes, I've got it.
Policy CS 26, so this is the officers talking about their own policies. CS 26 is referred to as the basis for the reason for refusal. The policy seeks to promote healthier lifestyles and reduce health inequalities through a variety of measures related to new developments. Whilst the policy recognises that the quality of the environment people live in greatly influences physical and mental health, the content and objective of the policy is concerned primarily with improving healthcare services, promoting healthier lifestyles and reducing health inequalities. Whilst it does require health impact assessments are submitted for all large-scale developments, which was done in this case, the policy is otherwise of limited relevance to the airport's application. So, again, that doesn't support the contention, does it, that that subpart of policy CS 26 is a requirement that all developments must improve health.
I mean, what they're saying here, it's of limited relevance, which I read and I can understand that. I'm not sure what it says about the requirement to improve health. I don't think it refers to that specifically here.
No, that's the whole point. It's you that rely upon this as some sort of injunction that, again, that we have to improve health, improve well-being, reduce air quality. The policy doesn't say anything of the sort. Officers thought it was of, frankly, limited relevance to this application.
I mean, I can repeat the answers I gave before, but I don't have any more to add. So.
Let's then just go on to criteria for the evaluation of results. Your paragraph 35, we can probably deal with these things fairly quickly. There's no dispute between us. So we're now looking at the criteria for when we look at the results, which we will do in a few moments. There's no dispute about the importance of the air quality standards and the objectives, is there, for assessing air quality results and significance
No,
of effects?
I agree with that, yes.
And there's no dispute, is there, as you, I think, make clear in here, that what one's looking at is assessing impacts on the local population. It's population health that we're interested in, isn't it?
Yes, we are. I mean, affecting impact on population also means impact on individual people.
Well, we will obviously be discussing that
Yes.
later in the week. I think you agree, however, with Mr. Pearce that compliance with the standards and the objectives is not the end of the assessment. It's still necessary, even if you're below the standards and objectives, it's still necessary to look at the effects.
Yes, I agree with
You
that.
agree that. And how that has been done is by reference to the IAQM and EPUK guidance, isn't it? We'll look at that in a moment. But that's an appropriate way, isn't it, to look at the significance of effects?
That's an appropriate way in the context of what the EIA objectives are, yes.
And indeed, you're a member of the IAQM, I think,
I am, yes.
as Mr. Pearce is. So let's look at CD 8.6. So these are the IAQM and UK EP guidance from Environmental Protection UK and the Institute of Air Quality Management for the consideration of air quality within land use planning and development control process. And if we look first at PDF page 6.
I've actually got it in paper, so
Oh,
if you
goodness.
could give me a page number, that would be good.
It's actually, fortunately for both of us, it's still page 6.
Okay.
And let's kind of look at those first two paragraphs, and we understand the purpose of the guidance. The EPUK and the IAQM have produced this guide to ensure that air quality is adequately considered in the land use planning and development control process. And again, you can read paragraph 1.2, but it's again setting out the purpose. And as we say, I think all parties are agreed that this is an appropriate basis on which to look at significance.
Yes, but for the purposes of EIA, yes. Yes.
Yes. And so let's look at page 19. Which again is dealing with purpose. So the air quality assessment is undertaken to inform decision-making with regard to the development. It does not in itself provide a reason for a granting or refusing planning permission. Almost all development will be associated with new emissions if the development is considered in isolation. In most cases, therefore, development will be associated with adverse impacts. These impacts require quantification and evaluation in the context of air quality objectives and existing air quality. The significance of the effects arising from the impacts of air quality will depend on a number of factors and will need to be considered alongside the benefits of the development in question. So there's an acknowledgement, isn't there, here when we were looking at the policies and we were looking at acceptability or satisfactory resolution and indeed health issues, an acknowledgement that you don't just look at the air quality results in isolation. One has to also, in terms of acceptability, balance benefits.
Yes, that's correct. And this paragraph goes on to talk about opportunities for reducing emissions which could well displace emissions. And that's exactly the sort of approach that we were looking for and didn't find.
Yes, well, we don't agree with each other on that, but Page 24.
But it is written here in black and white. So I think it's an important part of this guidance, and we've discussed some of the other the policy issues earlier. Yes.
Page 24 and page 25 sets out data sets and methodologies. Para 625, for example, important to recognise the focus of procedures used by local authorities to prepare their LAQM reports is designed specifically for the purposes of identifying whether any air quality objectives are likely to be exceeded. An air quality assessment for a development will need to go beyond this, with attention given to defining the magnitude of change that will take place even where the objectives are not exceeded. And there's no dispute between us, is it, that the air quality assessment did exactly that. It went beyond the objectives.
Yes, it used the objectives as a reference point, and it's characterised the impact using, for example, the descriptors in table 6.3 on page 25.
Yes, and so when the inspectors, when we get to it, look at the air quality results, they can see the words used, negligible, slight, moderate, substantial, and those are based, we're agreed, aren't we, on table 6.3.
That's correct. And they can also see whether that represents an improvement or worsening in air quality.
Of course.
Yep.
Thank you. And both the ES and the ESA followed exactly this methodology, didn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
So let's then look at some of the results applying this methodology to help the inspectors get an understanding of whether there are significant effects. And for this, we'll need to look at CD 2.20.5. And this is the air quality supporting data. So in CD 2.20.1, we get some of the summary tables, but these are the actual
Yes, that's right.
full tables.
Yes.
And table 7A.1, I suppose just above that table, it defines helpfully the terminology typically used in air quality, the concept of process contribution, PC, which is the amount that the development adds, and then the predicted environmental concentration, the PEC, which is the total concentration, including the PC.
The increment. Yes, that's right.
So I'm sure the inspectors will be very familiar with that, but just so that others can follow this. We then have table 7A.1 for NO2, pages and pages and pages of receptors, the vast majority of which have an impact which is negligible. So we can see, for example, just so we understand the table, looking at H001, the PC, in other words, the contribution of the development is 0.3% to the AQAL. The AQAL is just something that the Institute of Air Quality Management uses as a sort of shorthand for both the standards and the objectives, isn't it?
Yes, air quality assessment level, yes.
So there's nothing magical about
No.
AQAL, it's just the standards.
It's just the standard, yeah.
And we can see, we can look down occasionally, the percentage gets a little bit higher, so we can look at H019, for example, where the contribution, the PC gets up to 4.7%, but we can see that the the PEC is still below the AQUAL. There are a few which are identified as slight. So let's look at H56, for example. That's a slight. And we can see there that the PEC has got up to just very slightly over half the standard, but that's still very good air quality, isn't it? It's still very low.
It's still good compared to the air quality standard. These are properties along Downside Road that I mentioned previously in examination in chief. And the other thing to notice from this table is that virtually all those PC values that you're discussing are positive, so that means there's an increase from the airport at almost every location. There's a few, I can't remember the exact number, but there's a few that are negative that have an improvement, but most of them are a slight worsening, or slight or negligible in EIA terms.
And if the inspectors just want to get a feel for where the properties are, if you turn to PDF page 35, you can see there on one of a series of plans where all the receptor locations are, and so you can see those H50 and 40 numbers are typically along Downside Road. I'm going to draw attention to one later, H078, and you can see that that's the Airport Tavern. It's on the corner.
H078 is the Airport Tavern, yes.
So if we go back to that first table that we were looking at, where there are some negligibles and a very, very few slights, but even the slights, the PEC is only slightly above half the limit value. There are no likely significant effects there in EIQM terms. But there are no likely significant effects, are there?
Okay, so I think there are no impacts that fall above the slight threshold, and then it's a matter of judgment for how you interpret the overall impacts of a development.
Yes.
But I'm not arguing it. There's no argument between myself and Mr. Pearce on the interpretation of those results as regards the conclusions for EIA. No,
and therefore no argument. You're not suggesting that looking at that table that these are significant effects?
I am arguing that they're significant effects in the context of a situation where there is a policy imperative or policy requirement to improve air quality. It's not improving.
Imperative is there to
well, we've discussed that this morning. I don't want to go through that again. It's the policies that we've discussed this morning.
Is this based on your view that there is some sort of requirement to improve, and or based on your ambitious targets, which you repeat in your evidence?
This is based
multiple times.
This is based on my understanding of aviation policy and planning policy and the local policy which we've discussed this morning, which all is envisaging an improvement in air quality. The ambitious targets are outlined as the means by which those improvements can be delivered. And what I conclude from this is that at almost every location, and we can look at the NO2 results, the PM10 results, and the PM2.5 results, at almost every location there's a worsening. Of air pollution.
And it was this argument that there is some sort of requirement to reduce, and therefore anything else must be a significant adverse effect. It was exactly that argument that was rejected by the inspectors at Stansted, wasn't it?
I didn't read anything in their report that addressed the national aviation policy.
Yes. Put aside the national aviation policy, you ran a very similar argument that because there were increases, there should be reductions, and that was a reason for refusal. That's my recollection from having looked at your evidence. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that argument was not accepted, was it?
Well, I can't put aside the national policy because that's partly what my argument was based on. So you're correct that the appeal was allowed. But what consideration the inspectors gave, whether they agreed with me but thought it was of limited weight in that context, or whether they disagreed with the principle, we don't know.
Let's just move on. Let's look at PM10s. So in that same document, CD 2.20.5, page 14, and again we get a huge long list of receptors. Here we can see the PCs, the contributions, are again typically fractions of a percentage. The PECs, when expressed as a percentage of the AQUAL, the assessment level, are I think typically, indeed maybe all of them, well below 50%, I think. Even for the airport tavern, CDO 58, we're still at 36% of the AQUAL. Again, these are all correctly identified as negligible, aren't they?
Yes.
And there is no significant effect, is there?
Well, it's the same. I'll have to give you the same answer as I gave in relation to nitrogen dioxide.
Point once again is no matter how negligible, no matter how small, because they're positive or some of them are positive, therefore permission should be refused.
Well, it's not up to me to advise whether permission should be refused. I'm saying that this is an adverse impact that should be taken into account in the decision. And we also have to bear in mind that these air pollutants have health effects at levels below the air quality standards, as I think is agreed between us. So there is a real effect on health. It's not just a matter of an increase in a pollution level.
But by reference to the IAQM approach, are you saying that these are significant effects? I can see there it's an effect, I can see it's an adverse effect, the size of the effect is there. Are you saying that in EIA terms, this is significant? I think we agreed that NO2 wasn't.
No, I'm not. No, I'm saying within
not.
EIA terms, this is an appropriate assessment.
Okay. PM 2.5, we need to just turn to page 19 of this document. And again, same process, we can go through all the receptors and we can see that they're all negligible. Again, if we just pick out H078, Airport Tavern, just as a sort of prominent building that we know where it is, we can see there that the PEC, so the level of PM 2.5s with the development is 9.62, so below the WHO guideline level. Yeah?
Yes, that's correct. It's below the WHO guideline level. Yes,
the
10.
The PC, the contribution from the airport development is 2%, and the PEC as a percentage of the assessment level, the standard and objective, is 38.5%. I chose Airport Tavern because I think it's the largest PC percentage. Most of them are fractions of 1%. I think that's the largest. Sorry. Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, that is correct for PM 2.5. Again, we can agree, can't we, that in the IA terms, there's no likely significant effect.
I agree with that, yes.
I just want to pick up one sort of slight anomaly. We can agree as well, can't we, in this table for all these receptors around the airport, none of them is the PEC above 10. In other words, for none of them is the level above the WHO guideline.
I thought perhaps there were 2 that were above, but I may...
That's the anomaly that I'll come to in a moment.
Okay,
Just in this table, I think I'm right in saying none are above 10.
I haven't checked, but I can do. At least not recently.
Well, everyone can scan through them. I believe that to be the case. But there is a table, though, that I should just take you to, just so that you are aware. If we just look at CD 2.20.1 again, and we go to page 104, this was a slight point that I picked up actually over the weekend when I was looking at that. If you look at this table, at the bottom of page 104, bottom of page 104, table 7.3, you get the H receptors, but you here get 4 HR receptors.
Yes.
And 2 of those, HR 051 and HR 052, are slightly above the WHO level. And they're still obviously only 40% of the standards, but they are above the WHO level. But those receptors, it was a subset that was looked at, I think, in some of the Regulation 25 data, but those are in Bristol. So those are both in, I think it's, are they, is it Bedminster? Yeah, they're both in Bedminster. So miles from the airport where the background levels will be higher anyway, but you can see that the contribution from the airport, again, is 1/3 of 1%. So with those 2 caveats in mind, and you're right, we can agree, can't we, I think, that none of the assessment points are above the WHO guidelines.
Well, with the exception of these 2 points, I think distance from the airport doesn't disqualify them as being relevant, but I'm very happy to agree that only 2 of the assessed locations were above the World Health Organization guideline.
And both of these locations were already above the WHO figure. We can see the PC is 0.09 and 0.08, so the contribution's absolutely tiny. They're miles away, but they happen to be above the WHO figure because they're in Bristol.
Well, indeed, and it's important to take those kind of locations into account, but you're right, the impact is a small fraction.
That doesn't change, I think, our agreement that in EIA terms there's no significant effect here.
No, I'd agree with that. The impact is, in EIA terms, is as described in table 7.3.
Let's turn to ultrafine particles. We've already agreed, you told us indeed in your paragraph 19, what the key pollutants are, and you identified the 2 key pollutants in paragraph 19 as nitrogen and PM 2.5, but you say in the next sentence at the end of your paragraph 19 that UFPs are an emerging matter of concern for airports, and that's what we're going to discuss now. Again, just to confirm some points that we touched on earlier, there was nothing in the Council's scoping opinion, or indeed the officer's report, that required an assessment of ultrafine particles.
I believe not.
Can we just look then at the Air Quality Expert Group report? So that's CD 8.12. So this is the Air Quality Expert Group ultrafine particles in the UK, prepared for DEFRA and regional government. So let's just look at PDF page 20. And paragraph 1.6, towards the bottom of PDF page 20, tells us very clearly that there are no ambient air quality standards for UFPs in the UK or indeed anywhere else in the world. Okay, so there is nothing, is there, against which we can benchmark any effect from the development against any standard or threshold or anything else of that in order to assess significance of effect?
No, that's correct. I mean, that doesn't mean there's no effect. It just means that we can't assess how big any effect would be.
And there's a further problem for us in trying to carry out any assessment. Let's turn to PDF page 48. And turn towards the bottom of that page. There's a section that's 3.3.1, and the third paragraph there says there are far fewer monitoring sites producing routine ultrafine particle data than there are for PM 2.5, for example, which number about 75 across the UK. This is because many PM2 monitoring sites are required to meet EU air quality legislation requirements, whereas ultrafine particle measurements are not mandatory. These sites therefore produce much less monitoring data with which to assess spatial variations. So one of the problems that we have with ultrafine particles is not only are there no standards, but there's very little monitoring in the UK anyway.
I agree, yes.
Just touching on a point then on page 72 of this document. So page 72, towards the top, the second paragraph, the collection of PM 0.1 or smaller fraction of particles is not straightforward, although it can be achieved with separation of larger particles by impaction. However, the largest problem is the very small mass of material in PM 0.1, which provides considerable analytical challenges to obtain high quality data. We've kind of touched on that. And then a little bit further down, under minor constituencies, the third paragraph there, since many of the sources and formation mechanisms for constituency of PM 2.5 also lead to the emission and formation of ultrafine particles, which are a subset of PM 2.5. There are strong overlaps between the composition of ultrafine particles and that for PM 2.5. Now that's quite an important point, isn't it? There's this overlap, it's understood, between ultrafine particles and PM 2.5.
Yes, ultrafine particles are a component of PM2.5, and the reason why we're concerned about ultrafine particles is because by virtue of their extremely small size, they can have effects on health and physiology which are different to the effects of PM2.5. So when you're assessing on a mass basis, the mass of those ultrafine particles is very small compared to the mass of the PM2.5, but their effects may be disproportionately large.
What we can know, though, because of that relationship, is that if we look back, recall our discussion on PM2.5s, the process contribution of the development to PM2.5s was, in all cases, extremely small, and the PEC, in all cases, apart from our two, in Bristol, the PECs were always below the WHO guideline level.
That's correct for PM2.5, but not for ultrafine particles.
No, but we can't measure the ultrafine particles. There's no standard, is there?
I agree, and nowhere in my evidence have I suggested that
No.
that's needed. What I've done is to highlight the potential health concerns that are raised specifically in relation to airports elsewhere in this Air Quality Expert Group report, and suggested a strategy by which they could be managed.
But if we then look at where the expert group go with this, so let's turn on to page 96, their recommendations towards the bottom of the page. It says the group notes that the current UK continuous monitoring of UFP concentrations are currently only made in the southeast at just one roadside, one urban background and one rural site. Whilst the site in Birmingham is due to recommence monitoring, we anticipate the main source of UFPs will be similar across the UK, however this needs to be verified. Therefore, the group recommends that the establishment of further monitoring sites for particle number, extending to particle size distributions at a later date at sites outside the southeast of England. So there's no recommendation from the expert group as to some threshold or strategy or development control policy for individual decisions, are they? The whole subject is simply too uncertain at the moment.
I don't think that would be the role of the Air Quality Expert Group. They are what they say on the tin. They're a group of air quality experts. So they're advising on the science, and I would fully support the recommendations they've given here. I don't think they would be making a policy recommendation in the way that you suggest.
So let's just see where we get to in terms of government and the approach to this issue. Let's look at Aviation 2050. Which is CD 6.5. And let's turn to PDF page 84.
I'm sorry, could you give me that page number again?
Yes, of course. PDF, page 84.
84, thank you.
This so the inspectors can put this in the context of what government, what government says about it. So paragraph 3.127. The government recognises the need to take further action to ensure aviation's contribution to local air quality issues is properly understood and addressed, and is proposing the following measures. And then you get the first one, which relates to UFPs: improving the monitoring of air pollution, including ultrafine particles, in order to improve understanding of aviation's impact on local air quality. This will be achieved by standardising processes for airport air pollution monitoring and communication. So we can see the government's position. Obviously, we looked at the expert group, but the government's position on this is one of recognising it, but suggesting the need at this stage for the improvement of monitoring. It's not being put forward as a development control policy. There's simply too much uncertainty at the moment.
I agree with that. I don't believe there is a national policy that requires airports to assess and manage and avoid impacts due to ultrafine particles. What I'm proposing is a means of, well, I look at it from the perspective that we currently have an unquantified adverse health impact. We know that we know that ultrafine particle levels are going to increase. We don't know what effect that would have in health. One way to ensure that that doesn't cause a problem for the local people is to ensure that ultrafine particle emissions don't increase, and that's what I've suggested.
And if on that same page we just look down, glance down at footnote 83, we're told that ultrafine particles are the smallest group of particles in the atmosphere and comprise a minor component of PM 2.5 and PM 10. UFPs are believed to contribute to the toxicity of airborne particulate matter, but the magnitude of their contribution is currently unclear, which again is why I keep putting this point to you that there's just uncertainty. We just don't know at the moment.
Absolutely, I agree. And that's why I've proposed a method that would avoid whatever the impacts are.
Just going to move now to slightly different topic, last topic hopefully, which we'll be able to get through before lunch. In section 6 of your evidence, you start in paragraph 105 by, as you do in many parts of the evidence, many of the paragraphs, by telling us about innovative solutions and incentives against ambitious targets, and we've discussed that, and we know now what that means. And we know also, don't we, from the discussion we had about the planning practice guidance, that mitigation options need to be proportionate to the likely impact. Do you recall?
Yes, I do.
So these mitigation measures need to be proportionate, don't they, to the impacts that we looked at just now, the mostly negligible, a very few handful of slights?
Yes, and also to the requirement, as I see it, for an improvement in air quality.
Yes.
So we need to consider both of those aspects.
Now, in terms of the proposed measures, and I'm going to try not to go through these in enormous detail. We've got a session where we'll be talking about some of these things. In relation to the airport surface access strategy, the target is to increase public transport mode share by 2.5%. That's over the base figure, which measured on a, if I can put it like this, the traditional method that the airport used of counting bus tickets was 17.5%, but used based on the CAA basis of the way the CAA measures public transport is 22%. So it's 2.5% on top of that. I take it as you're not the highways witness, you're not particularly qualified to know whether 2.5% is ambitious or otherwise for this airport.
I am not the transport witness. Basically, all I've expressed the figures that I've observed for other airports in paragraph 107. But if we wish to look in any more detail, that would be for Mr. Collis.
But actually, Bristol Airport, based on this sort of common CAA data, performs very well, doesn't it, against other regional airports? you want to look at Mr. Witchell's evidence?
So if by regional airports you're comparing with
Well, the London
airports
airports,
outside
obviously,
London and South East.
you know, Heathrow has direct, and London City have direct tube or Dockland light rail connections. Gatwick has rail, Stansted has rail, Luton has rail. So if we put aside the London system, compared with other regional airports, Bristol, I'm not going to suggest it's the best, but it's pretty good, isn't it? It's better than many of them.
Yes, I mean, I agree. I've looked at the figures for all the airports, and I agree. It looks reasonable compared to those airports. I think my take on that is that why should we be ruling out airports that have an effective public transport system that provides the connection? Surely
Yes.
the benchmark for ambition should be whatever the best performing airports are, and if that means that Bristol Airport is underperforming compared to other airports because they have better infrastructure, then that's something that I think should be taken into account.
Okay. You tell us in your evidence that overall the measures are welcome, but you then go back to your point, but not ambitious enough. And you know, maybe during the surface access topic we get back to that, but I don't think, as I put it already, I don't think you're in a position to judge whether the ambition should be 3% or 3.5% or any other
No, I'm not. No.
percentage. That's just not your role, very fairly.
No.
As far as the air quality action plan is concerned, obviously there's going to be a commitment, as required by officers originally, to that one be produced, and that would be a commitment secured by condition, is it?
Yes.
Yes, and I think it's currently draft condition 16, but I
Yes.
might be wrong. But the principle of that is agreed, and there is sense, isn't there, in having an air quality action plan that is able to adapt and evolve, if necessary, over time to deal with emerging circumstances.
Absolutely, yes. I think both the condition 16 proposed by North Somerset Council and that proposed by Bristol Airport Limited both have that flexibility built in.
And you've proposed a whole series of measures to improve air quality, and obviously there will ultimately be a discussion on those when the air quality action plan is produced. But you know, as a matter of principle, there's no reason why some of those shouldn't be in the action plan, is there?
Well, no, but on the other hand, there's no, at the moment, there's no guarantee that these or other measures will be in, and that measures will deliver the kind of improvements that North Somerset Council is looking for.
As far as the junction improvements on the A38, the downside road junction in particular there, the highways evidence shows that that does reduce queuing at that junction. Yes?
Yes.
And that does deliver, therefore, air quality improvements. There are fewer standing cars.
It delivers improvements for the locations immediately adjacent to that junction, but you, as we saw, you don't have to go very far away along Downside Road before those improvements are no longer available and it becomes a worsening.
Yes, but for that location, that's an improvement.
For that, yes, for those small number of properties there, that is an improvement, yes.
Okay. And we should also note, shouldn't we, that officers, council's officers, were satisfied with the proposed mitigation, the original mitigation. There are some enhancements, I think, since then, and that's recorded in the officer's report again, isn't it?
Again, don't have that immediately to hand, but I don't have any reason to doubt that.
I'll give the reference so that other people can look at it, but it's CD 4.11, page 144. It sets out summary of result, compliant with legislation and policy. Dr. Broomfield, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Broomfield. Just a couple of questions.
Yes.
We'll finish for lunch. Okay. And we'll come back afterwards and do the re-examination. Okay. Let me just go back, and it does pick up a little bit on the questions you've just been asked. Your table 1 in your summary, proof of evidence, we did look at it earlier. You've got 2 columns in there, and one of the issues that we picked up on was this confusion. I hope you can sort of clear it up. It's about the air quality action plan, which you put in category 4. So quite boldly you say would not deliver an improvement in air quality. Well, just putting aside that statement for a minute, it's a case that the council have included that condition in their list of conditions, haven't they?
Yes, we have.
Right. Okay. For them to do that, they must have been satisfied the condition was necessary.
Yes, I think.
Right.
I think the. Sorry, do carry
Okay.
on. Yeah.
So if it's necessary, then that really does conflict with your assertion that that it would not deliver an improvement. You're saying it's going to be ineffective. The council is saying it's necessary. Maybe it's not one to answer right now, but when we come back on Friday morning and do the conditions discussion, whether you could talk to the council and you could reconcile those 2 statements.
Yes, I think the reason I have this as would not deliver an improvement in air quality is because it's referring to the current air quality action plan, which envisages monitoring and then taking remedial action if an increase in pollution is observed. So that's the existing air quality action plan. And I was saying that wouldn't deliver an improvement in air quality. At best, that's kind of a backstop to stop things getting a lot worse. Whereas the air quality strategy, is it an air quality strategy that we're looking at under condition 16, is much more focused on measures for improving air quality. So that's the reason why there's this discrepancy, but I will look at that and try and clarify further.
I think Stansted had a very similar condition as well, didn't they, part of their permission. So you're not suggesting the inspector got that wrong, or indeed the council in that case actually recommended that condition as well?
Yeah, so I think, again, at Stansted there was a condition relating to monitoring, which is fine and it's good. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing to do. You know, we should definitely have monitoring. And then at Stansted there was also a condition around delivering improvements in air quality, which was, as you rightly say, rejected by the inspectors. So I have, in what we're putting forward now as our proposal for condition 16, we've made some substantial changes to that compared to what was proposed at Stansted. So I'm sure we'll discuss that on Friday. But yes, thank you.
Thank you. Right, next, electric vehicle charging points, which was touched upon in terms, we had the question of why it wasn't included, because you've included it in your list of potential measures.
Yes.
But it's not included as a specific condition, not at this stage anyway. I guess you just conceded that there was a possibility that the air quality action plan could include that sort of measure.
Absolutely, it could include it. Yes, I think in the section 106 that was under discussion at the planning meetings back in the beginning of last year, there was a proposal for inclusion of 10 electric vehicle charging points. So my comment on that is that's minimal and it's not going to have a significant effect. But as part of the air quality strategy that we would be looking for under condition 16, that would definitely be one of the elements, and perhaps an enhanced provision.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you. I think Mr. Humphreys covered the final question we had, which was about the public transport proposals. I don't think I need to ask a question on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Taylor, I'm conscious of the time. Re-examination, how long do you envisage?
Last time I said 15 minutes, it was 25.
You were.
I think that's about 20 minutes.
20.
But as you know, already notoriously underlong.
I'm content to keep going, but I don't want to go past 1:15.
No, okay,
So,
I'll keep an eye.
all right.
All right. Dr. Brimfield, starting with the Air Quality Action Plan point first. What is there that prevents the development of a detailed action plan now, which could then, the impact of which could then be assessed now, and which also provided for flexibility for change in the future?
There's nothing to stop that happening now. I think it would be possible to build in flexibility, for example, with a review process to account for new initiatives and new information.
And what assessment do we have of the impact of an air quality action plan going forward, if permission's granted?
At the moment, we don't have any assessment.
Thank you. Now, you were asked a number of questions about ultrafine particles. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Just want to take you in your proof, please, to page 27. And at page 27, you set out there an extract from the Air Quality Expert Group report, CD812, that you were taken to, do you remember?
Yes.
You weren't taken to this particular passage. And you've set out the paragraphs under the heading of health impacts that's set out in that document. It refers to UFP penetrated deep into the respiratory system. This, together with the hypothesis that the toxicity of particulate matter is governed by the surface area of the particles rather than their mass, has led to suggestions that ultrafine particles may be particularly harmful to health. There's a reference to the WHO and the WHO recommending, final paragraph, efforts to reduce the numbers of UFP and engine emissions should continue. Health Effects Institute considered that current evidence did not convincingly support the suggestion that UFP alone can account in substantial ways for health effects that have been associated with ambient pollutants such as PM2.5. However, they noted that independent effects of UFP cannot be ruled out. Now, with that in mind, and of course bearing in mind the precautionary principle, what approach do you think is appropriate, given the uncertainties associated with UFP, in seeking to mitigate potential health impacts from UFP?
Yes, I think the extract that you wrote, that you read out, highlights the potential for independent effects, so effects of ultrafine particles on health, which are independent of those resulting from PM2.5. So adopting a precautionary approach, which is what we have sought to do. I think the only practical approach is to seek to avoid an increase in emissions of ultrafine particles, and that's consistent with our approach of seeking to avoid any increase in PM2.5. So that I think is the appropriate approach in this case.
Right, thank you. Now, in relation to PM2.5, again, you were asked a number of questions about that, and can I just take you to your proof, page 26, paragraph 85, where you again set out a passage from the Comiat report, which says that in general it's accepted on the basis of time series studies that no threshold of effect of particulate matter on mortality can be defined for the population as a whole. This has caused some difficulties for toxicologists. I was to explain the effect of very low national concentrations, but the likely distribution of exposure, together with the sensitivity of some individuals across large populations, make it plausible that there is some risk to individuals even at very low background concentrations.
Yes.
You see that? If we put that together with the passage that you cite from the government's policy paper on the Environment Bill at paragraph 83, let's just have a look at that. This paragraph, this is from the government's policy paper, refers to reducing the annual mean level of fine particulate matter in ambient air. It says, whilst the new concentration threshold will be challenging to meet in certain parts of the country, especially in densely populated urban areas, it will not drive action to improve air quality in parts of the country which already achieved the threshold value. Such a target will also not drive action once that threshold level has been achieved. Therefore, a concentration threshold alone is unlikely to result in the greatest public health benefit. Now, how do you read that in the context of health effects that are found in some individuals at very low background concentrations? What is the government seeking to do?
So the government is acknowledging that there is an effect on health due to fine and indeed ultrafine particulate matter at levels which comply with current standards and indeed with the World Health Organization guideline, which is currently being considered as a policy reference point. So what they're saying there is that if you just look at complying with the standards, that will not deliver the kind of health improvements that they're seeking to achieve. So other approaches are needed to deliver health improvements.
And how consistent is that with your evidence that in relation to airport expansion, improvement is required?
I think that's entirely consistent with my evidence. The improvement in air quality that we are requesting will deliver these kind of health benefits for local populations.
Thank you. Now, let's turn to NO2 next. You address that on your pages 23 to 24. I want to take you to paragraph 75 of your proof, please. Another quote from a different COMIAT report. Here, COMIAT explained that the available evidence does not suggest that the threshold for effects exists at the population level. However, as only some of the studies have included formal tests for this, the possibility of a threshold cannot be ruled out. It's considered possible that any level of annual average concentration of NO2 would apply additional risk to at least some of the population, whether from NO2 itself, assuming it has an effect, or from covariant pollutants. And it says this: recent studies have shown associations of mortality with annual average NO2 at concentrations lower than previous studies had shown. And there is now evidence of associations in cohorts in which the range of outdoor levels reaches as low as 5 micrograms per metre cubed annual average NO2 concentrations. Now, you'll recall you were taken to table 7A.1 in the ES addendum,
yes.
The PEC values.
Yeah.
When we look at those, and we have the 5 microgram per metre cubed level in mind, given that level, and given that as we've seen, the airport increases annual average concentrations in most locations, what can you say about the health impacts of granting permission for this scheme?
Yes, so I don't think there's any suggestion that 5 microgram per metre cubed level is under consideration for introduction as any kind of threshold or a standard or guideline. But what it does tell us is that exposure to nitrogen dioxide is harmful to health at very low levels. There's no clear evidence to the threshold. So it means that health effects will occur resulting from any increase in nitrogen dioxide. We can't, at the moment, I don't think we have the evidence before us to say how large or small they will be. All we know is that an increase in pollution levels, because the baseline levels are well above the 5 microgram metre cubed you refer to there, any increase in pollution levels will have an increase in health impacts for local people.
Thank you. Now, you were asked some questions about CS 26 and the way in which officers considered it in the reports. Do you remember?
Yes.
You were taken to CD 411. I'd like to take you, please, to page 128 of CD 411, if I may.
CD 411, just bear with me. And so that was page
128.
128.
PDF. And hopefully in the middle of that page, you'll see a reference to policy CS26.
Yes, I do.
And it says that policy supports proposals which promote healthy living and reduces health inequalities. It also recognises how environmental design, land use and the location of development can have a significant impact on people's exposure to noise and other environmental pollution. It promotes access to health and recreational facilities and employment, which all contribute to physical and mental well-being. And then it says this: policy CS26 emphasises the need for health impact assessments on large-scale development, and it expects applicants to demonstrate how proposed development will contribute to improving health and well-being of the local population. So what is the policy objective that officers said to members had to be achieved in order to accord with policy CS26?
The policy objective is to improve the health and well-being of the local population.
All right, thank you. Now, can I take you, please, back to the core strategy? You were taken to that. It was just it's CD 520 you were taken to, and on page 104 of that document, you were taken to paragraph 3.320. You recall being taken to this,
Sorry, I'm
this
just getting
paragraph? Just making sure you get there.
So yes, so this is the
It's the North
Core
Somerset
strategy.
core strategy, and this
Yep.
is the text that follows CS26. And
No.
under the
I
heading,
think I've got the wrong document, sorry, I've got CS8 here for some reason. Could you give me the page number
it's
again,
104,
please? 104. Thank you.
paragraph 3.320.
Oh, yeah, I was at 3.120, sorry. Yes, I've got it now.
Okay. And at the very end of this paragraph, it says the health impact assessment can identify the potential health gains and potential risks to health, and can help to identify additional measures to reduce or avoid these risks. Now, how, when planning permission is granted, does a planning permission require additional measures to come forward? What mechanism?
I guess when there is a significant impact has been identified, which requires mitigation.
Right. And if you want to require a developer to do something when you grant planning permission, how do you require them to do that?
Through planning condition, for example.
Right. And if we go to the NPPF, again, I think it's CD 5.8, and we go to page 17 of that. Find it myself, it's here somewhere. We should, page 17, we should find paragraph 55 of the NPPF, which has a new number now, which I don't know, so I'm sorry. It says, planning conditions should be kept to a minimum and only imposed where they're necessary, relevant to planning and to the development permitted.
I do apologise, I haven't got to the right
Okay.
paragraph.
Paragraph 55 on page 17 of CD 5.8.
Okay, I have it, thank you.
Okay, I'll start again. It says, conditions should be kept to a minimum and only imposed where they're necessary, relevant to planning and to the development to be permitted, enforceable, precise and reasonable in all other respects. And it also goes on at 56 to refer to planning obligations only being required or sought where they're necessary to make the development acceptable in planning terms.
Yes.
Now, we saw the text at 3.320 which talked about using HIAs to identify additional measures, and you explained that that would be achieved through imposing a condition. How could additional measures be required by planning condition pursuant to an HIA if the core strategy didn't contain a policy that required health improvement?
If the core strategy didn't require...
Did not include an objective of achieving health improvement. How could that be done?
Yes, indeed. So the core strategy would have to include an objective along those lines for the planning conditions to be appropriate.
All right, thank you. Now, you were asked some questions about the quotation in your evidence from APF 2050, which you've got set out on your page 18. Do you remember paragraph 3.101? And this was in the context that was put to you of surface access strategies. What version of the airport surface access strategy have you seen produced so far?
So that's difficult for me to recall. I think I have analysed it. I'm just checking to see what I have looked at.
You've seen a draft airport surface access strategy, have you?
Yes, there was a draft surface access strategy that I reviewed in section 6 of my evidence.
Okay. Have a look at that.
I think.
So you refer to as an access strategy would be designed.
Yes, so this is, if you see in paragraph 106 of my evidence, this is measures that were described in the original section 106 agreement that was under discussion in 2020.
All right, well I can pursue that elsewhere. Now, 3101, if we look at the words there, it refers to ambitious targets in the plural.
Yes.
Which reduce carbon and congestion and improve air quality. Now, when we're looking at what it is the ambitious targets are to achieve, what is the objective?
The objective, as far as my area of expertise is concerned, is to improve air quality.
Right. And so if you don't have a target that relates to air quality, how can you assess whether you are improving air quality?
You have to have targets that relate to air quality. They don't necessarily have to be specific to air quality emissions or concentrations, but they do have to directly relate to air quality, and there has to be a means of evaluating their benefit and their effectiveness.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Those are all the questions I have.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Broomfield. Okay, we'll break for lunch, so if we reconvene at 2:10. Thank you.